Anthropocene.
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 Anthropocene. Giorgio, help me.
Do I have to pronounce it correctly?
Some of this is something medical.
Something to do with old.
I think that's to do with climate change.
So something to do with people?
Anthro means man, right? Or human man?
I don't know the meaning of that word.
Oh, the Anthropocene. Yes, I know what that word means.
Can I get a hint?
The current geological age, viewed as the
Period during which human activity has been dominant influence on climate and environment.
I think it means that the environment and it's been damaged.
Oh, we're in the Anthropocene.
Current geological age. I should have known that.
Man, that's such a good word for right now, dude.
Talk about maybe the score and the numbers. This is the Human Development Index. We put it out. We put out a narrative based on a mathematical calculation of an index. And so this year's numbers for Malaysia look good in the traditional Human Development Index, which, as you know, is a composite of income, per capita income, health status, and educational status and achievements in a grosso modo at the level of the country. So Malaysia's done well. We are actually up one rank because it's an index, it's a league table, of course, of countries around the world, countries and territories. So we are up one rank from to 62 from 63 last year. We are also the score, the calculated score on the index is also up to 0.81, which is, just to give you a little bit of a perspective, it's in classification terms that makes Malaysia a very high human development country. It puts Malaysia in that group of countries, the top, the high, very, very high human development. But also, just to give you another check, when we first started measuring it in 1990, Malaysia's score at that time was at 0.64. So there you are, a phenomenal achievement by all accounts. Now that's the numbers, colleagues. Oh, sorry, I must actually make the caveat that the data we have used to calculate the score is 2019 data. As you know, those of you who dabble in numbers and statistics, there's always a time lag to acquire real-time data. So we have used the 2020 Human Development Report uses 2019 data. So while I'm saying that the picture looks good, it's pre-COVID data. Next year we will have a slightly more gloomy conversation because, as you know, and UNDP has spoken to this, human development has slid back in this past year, this absolutely tragic past year. So, colleagues, then let me say a few words about the history of the Human Development Report. We always use this occasion of the Human Development Report from day one as a reflection space, as a space to come together and ask, based on data and evidence, not just polemical and words and impressions, but based on data and evidence, how are we doing, grosso modo, as the human species on human development? And we have over the past, first we started from the simple paradigm in 1990 with, as you know, the Nobel laureate Professor Amartya Sen and Mahbub-ul Haq came together and helped UNDP think this through, to look beyond income as a measure of development. So, and therefore it became a more composite measure, which we started with in the 90s. over the years, we've dabbled with more and more parameters. We've added more parameters into this composite measure. And we've asked ourselves some reflective questions. So we have dabbled with, for example, multidimensional poverty, and therefore looking at multiple deprivations just beyond just income, health, and education, which were our starting parameters. Eventually, we've also asked us questions about freedom and choices, and whether these things also matter in development. You may be living in a gilded palace, and be very well off income-wise, but you can't vote because of your gender. Is the kind of question we asked ourselves: what development does that represent? So there you are. And this year, therefore, at the 30th anniversary, we've asked ourselves another big question. But before I go to that, let me just reflect for 1 second on what we said in last year's, the 2019 Human Development Report. It was released roughly around this time of last year. I think the 20th of December, if I recall right. And we had talked about two new emerging inequalities. We talked about inequalities in general, but we talked about two new emerging inequalities: the digital inequality, and we had talked about inequalities brought about by climate disruptions. Little did any of us know that 3 months from that moment, when we released last year's report, the digital inequality question hit us right in the face as we all went into socially distant and isolated and home-based work. Who had digital and who had not digital, who was on the digital pathway and who was not, clearly showed through. And we were stunned as to how quickly it became evident and became a norm as to how digital inequality can make a huge difference to whether you can earn a living or not, whether you can continue to pay your bills or meet your medical expenses, etc. A lot dependent on whether you were on the digital highway or not. 1 in 3 Malaysian children, and I'm quoting the media, we have not done our own independent research on this. 1 in 3 Malaysian children faced a deprivation because they either did not have digital hardware or connectivity in the process of home-based education. So there you are. I thought it's important to just remind ourselves a little bit about last year's report and how perversely prescient it was. Anyway, so this year we took a step back. We took a epochal step back. We said, let's look at human history of the planet and look at what is called the age of humans, because as the short film showed, the discussion on Anthropocene is really, we are borrowing the geological term in a big picture sense, right from the start of history, literally, to now, human history, as in human existence, not written history or civilizational history. Because this is the first time we have come into the age of humans, and this is the first time where, instead of the planet shaping a species is shaping the planet, with consequences that we feel we should be quite worried about. And you'll see a little later in this morning's program that the findings are quite dramatic about how human beings are impacting the planet when measured in a certain way. So what we have done this year, again, expanding our space for reflection, but using data and mathematical techniques and analytics, we have added an adjustment to the index, an adjustment for planetary load. It's still very crude. It's simply an addition of 2 parameters of how much our countries, each of our countries, are intervening in climate change, particularly carbon emissions, and how much is our material load, which colleagues later will explain in more detail. I don't want to take my opening remarks time to say too much about it. But as soon as we adjust for planetary load, even highly evolved, highly human developed countries, high on the index, their ranks drop dramatically. And that's very, very sobering. We kind of anecdotally and instinctively know it, but it's not some, when you see it in hard numbers, when you just play with simulations, then it becomes quite stark. Malaysia, actually, when you adjust for planetary load, drops 2 stories. It drops from the current very high human development achievement to medium, not even the high. There's another category in between. It drops to medium once you adjust for planetary load. Again, as I said, it's a very crude measure. It's still not a highly evolved system of measuring planetary load, how much load human beings, anthropoids, are putting on the planet. But it's still an interesting and stark reminder of what of the impact that we're having on the planet, and how, as I said at the beginning, how we are shaping the planet for the first time as species that's shaping the planet. So what in the report we go on to not just highlight the problem, but also talk about a few exploratory solutions. We start out with the premise that for too long we have been solving in one domain. We solve for one thing: climate change, trade deficit. We solve for high debt to GDP ratio. We solve for a health challenge. We solve for an educational challenge. We are not solving for more integrated, connect the dots, because the fundamental tenet on which we are basing some of the arguments in this human development report is there are big connections between what's happening socially, what's happening planetarily, ecologically, and what's happening economically, globally. So we are looking beyond singular solutions, the silver bullet and all the rest of it, all those wonderful cliches we use, but looking at more integrated, connecting the dots solutions, and looking at, when we plug one hole, what is it doing to another problem. So that's our starting tenet, but then three more sort of concrete areas where we open a conversation. One is to look at nature-based solutions. Get really ambitious about climate change. Work on the climate promise. As you saw, colleagues, last Saturday was the 5th anniversary of the Paris Climate Accord, and it was very encouraging to see the 2 biggest emitting countries, China and the United States, come back to the table and make commitments. But you must have also seen that these are 50-year and 60-year, by 2050 and 2060 commitments. They are not the hard, taking the bull by the horns commitments that we have to do to seek transformation. So our first plea in this report is to look at transformative solutions through nature-based solutions, and more will be said about this, not least by our expert speakers, but also by our panelists. The second conversation we want to open in this report, colleagues, is the issue of incentives and regulations, the old carrots and sticks discussion. We are focused way too much on the wrong sense of incentives. We cannot change human behavior. We cannot change economic agency of human beings if the incentives are in the wrong place, if the incentives reward the wrong things, and if regulations also do not follow up with the ambition of change. So that's our second premise. And finally, on the premise that somehow social and environmental tensions are somehow correlated, and we are beginning to see this in the last few human development report, the analytical exercises we are doing, including the little commentary I did about the digital inequality question. On the premise that social and ecological tensions and stresses are somehow interconnected, we are also talking about re-looking at our social norms, looking at a much more planet-based socialization, a planet-based education system, a planet-based social contract, a planet and sympathy-based, empathy-based between human beings, social contract. So rethinking our paradigm. And it's not too difficult. We saw with the COVID crisis, the wearing social masks is now a norm. Wearing face masks is now a norm. I'm sorry. It's possible when the incentives or the regulations or just the driving energy is focused in a certain direction. So it's possible to look at social norms in a different way and to be much more socialized and aware about the impact we are having on the planet. Colleagues, I will stop here, and I really, really welcome you to this, what will be a very interesting discussion with our colleagues, with our scholars and experts. I just want to finish with one quote from Mahatma Gandhi, who said, the planet has enough for everybody's needs, but not enough for everybody's dreams. So on that note, colleagues, let's go on to have a lovely morning and a good discussion. As usual, it's the beginning of a conversation to be continued. I welcome you all on behalf of UNDP. Over to you, YB.
Thank you, Mr. Nilag, for that elaborative and thoughtful opening remarks all the way from New York. Thank you again for reminding us how important Human Development Report is and how it affects everyone. Now, I would like to invite everyone to listen to the officiating message by Yang Berhormat Khairy Jamaluddin, Minister of Science, Technology and Innovation, Malaysia.
In the greatest sweep of history, our presence, the presence of human beings, has been fleeting. We have existed for less than 1% of the life of our planet. It took us 13.8 billion years to appear from the beginning of the universe. But what an impact we have made. In our brief existence, human beings have demonstrated a tremendous propensity for progress. We have created an impressive modern civilization that has brought prosperity and well-being to so many of our species. The technological frontier that we expand constantly has allowed us to sustain and multiply this progress. We have harnessed the gifts of our planet to give us food, water, energy. And we are not a species content with just the Earth. We have long set our eyes on galactic ambitions, aiming for and reaching the stars, in order for human beings to continue to survive and thrive many millennia from now. Yet our collective imprimatur has left its scars. It has sent this beautiful home planet of ours on an environmental trajectory that, if not reversed, will see damage that can never be repaired. While many live lives that are peaceful and, if not prosperous, yet dignified, many have suffered the consequences of conflict and inequity. If this is the Anthropocene, an age where humans shape the planet more than it has shaped us, we need to own up to the reality that while we have been given the abilities no other species have, we have also come up wanting in so many ways. The present pandemic that has engulfed the world and disrupted all our lives is not a black swan. Scientists have warned for years that we could all get sick from any number of zoonotic viruses. climate change, environmental degradation, changing migration patterns, dense urban centers, all make a pandemic almost inevitable. What do we do now? How we recover from this will say everything about us as a species. Will we take this opportunity to address structural inequity that has been exacerbated by the pandemic? Working from home during a mandated shutdown in a comfortable upper middle class house is different from having to live behind closed doors in a dimly lit, badly ventilated, dilapidated, and small public housing. Online learning can be effective and fun with a fast internet connection and a good tablet. It is less so for many without that access. This pandemic has deepened the cleavages of inequity. As we welcome the incredible scientific breakthrough that we have seen over the last week, with the commencement of what will be the biggest vaccination program in human history, we are also reminded of how this light at the end of the tunnel is fractured by not enough global solidarity, and once again, inequity. Although attempts have been made to secure pooled purchase for less developed countries, it still will not be enough to balance the massive procurements undertaken by rich, advanced countries. As they begin to inoculate their citizens, billions more around the world will only look on, wondering when they will receive their immunization and when their already stretched public healthcare systems can get reprieve with the arrival of their COVID-19 vaccines. Many continue to live with inequity. Let them not die from inequity. These vaccines must be available to everyone, fast, and at affordable prices. As we welcome the Anthropocene, let us be reminded that its outcome must only be that we leave this earth better for those that will inherit it than what it was that we inherited. Thank you to the UNDP for inviting me to officiate the Human Development Report 2020. And may God bless humanity and this earth that sustains us.
Thank you again, Yang Berhormat Khairy Jamaluddin, Minister of Science, Technology and Innovation Malaysia, for that passionate and inspiring officiating address. Next, I would like to invite Dr. Haniza Khalid, Senior Development Economist of UNDP Malaysia, Singapore and Brunei Darussalam, to take the floor to present UNDP's Human Development Report 2020.
Yang Berhormat Minister Khairy Jamaluddin, Mr. Niloy Banerjee, Resident Representative UNDP Malaysia, Singapore and Brunei Darussalam, estimated panelists, ladies and gentlemen. For the first time in history, instead of planet shaping humans, humans are shaping the planet. The pressures are so great that scientists argue we are in a new geological age, the Anthropocene, the age of humans. As a species, we have made incredible progress. We have improved the health, education, and livelihoods of billions. But our actions, particularly our dependence on fossil fuels and material consumption, are driving not just climate change and biodiversity collapse, but ocean acidification, air and water pollution, and land degradation. We are destabilizing the very systems upon which we rely on for our survival at an unprecedented speed and scale. Consider climate change. Within the past year, extraordinary fires have scorched enormous areas of Australia, the Brazilian Pantanal, eastern Siberia in Russia, and the west coast of the USA. The 2020 Atlantic hurricane season set either new records or was on the verge of doing so, both for the number of storms and their strength. The planet's biodiversity is in crisis. Almost 70% of wildlife might have been lost since 1970. The COVID pandemic stands as an example of the effects of large-scale shocks that can emerge out of ecological systems buckling under pressure from human activities. COVID-19 has spread quickly around an interconnected world, taking root wherever it has landed and thriving especially in the cracks in societies, exploiting and exacerbating pre-existing inequalities in human development. And it is a human development crisis. As this figure shows, as early as May, we showed the pandemic's fallout on education, health and income was already threatening to reverse overall global progress in human development for the first time since we began writing the Human Development Report. As last year's Human Development Report made plain, many inequalities in human development have been increasing and continue to do so. Climate change, among others, will only make them worse. Put in another way, the burden of planetary changes is not equally distributed across people. The reality that we see today is destabilizing in that it rewards current production and consumption trends or patterns. Online business is lucrative, but clearly not environmentally friendly. The rate that we use water and pollute the air that we breathe shows that we do not see the link between our habits and its effect on the planet, thereafter the effect on the poor. Rural farmers disproportionately face the brunt of agrobiodiversity loss, especially soil microbial diversity loss. More than 90% of the world's fisheries have been fully exploited, have been overexploited, or have collapsed altogether. Economic losses from hurricanes, fire, and floods are felt greater by the poor, most of them not in possession of any form of risk insurance or large savings or assets. Ladies and gentlemen, experts argue that development has often come at the planet's expense. This graph shows that high human development tends to go hand in hand with high resource use. If we looked at greenhouse gases, we would see a similar story. No country in the world has yet achieved very high human development without putting an immense strain on the planet. But we could be the first generation to do so. And also to right this wrong. That is the next frontier for human development. This is the 30th anniversary of the first Human Development Report. And so it is timely to refresh the human development concept and metrics, to think that human flourishing can happen alongside the easing of pressures on the planet. It is important to empower people in three ways: by enhancing equity, by pursuing innovation, and by instilling a sense of stewardship of nature. The unequal distribution of nature's contribution to people and of environmental degradation costs are often rooted in the imbalances of power in the community. Innovation, which gave humans many of the tools which inadvertently created the planet pressure, can be harnessed to ease planetary pressures. Beyond advances in science, such as in hydrogen fuel cell technology and similar examples, innovation must involve a social process of change, meaning it should include institutional innovations that ultimately change the way we live and the way we see the world. Stewardship of nature simply means understanding that humans is part of a web on the planet. Instilling a sense of stewardship of the planet while benefiting from it is exactly what the indigenous peoples of the world have been trying to tell us for the past 100 years. The report identifies 3 building blocks to create real lasting change, working with not against nature, improving incentives and changing social norms. Everyone has a part to play. Studies suggest that 80% of people already think it is important to protect the planet, but fewer than half are likely to take action. Why? Perhaps people are less likely to act according to their values if it implies personal sacrifice, financial costs, increased effort, or simply inconvenience. Solutions that work with and not against nature can help both people and planet to prosper. A regenerating forest, for example, absorbs carbon and protects wildlife. It can provide a sustainable food source to those who live there and generate the rain that provides fresh water to those living far away. Too often, the incentives and regulations that influence decision-making promote rather than prevent planetary damage. Getting carbon pricing right is a critical example. The world spent over 300 billion in 2019 in subsidizing our dependence on fossil fuels and making it harder for clean energy to compete. But carbon pricing alone may not work or have political support if people lack alternatives and are simply asked to bear a higher financial burden. A new era, the Anthropocene, requires new metrics of progress. The report presents an adjustment to the HDI for planetary pressures, which we call the Planetary Pressures Adjusted Human Development Index, the PHDI. It is an experimental index and is meant, just like its predecessors, to encourage public debate and shine a light on success stories that offer insights for others to follow. The PHDI takes the original Human Development Index and adjusts it according to how much pressure each nation is, per capita wise, placing on the planet in two areas: their carbon dioxide emissions and their material footprint. For countries on the lower end of the development spectrum, the impact of the adjustment is generally small. But for countries with high or very high human development, gaps open up, reflecting the ways that their development paths are impacting the planet. These countries are the green dots that you see on the screen. For example, more than 50 countries drop out from the very high human development group, which comprise 64 to 65 countries, reflecting their dependence on fossil fuels and material footprint. No country has yet achieved that sweet spot of very high human development and low planetary pressures. But that does not mean that it is impossible. This report argues that it is possible and offers guidance on how human development can move us in the right direction. Ladies and gentlemen, I will now present some key findings in the 2020 Human Development Report that pertain specifically to Malaysia. The East Asia and the Pacific region, where Malaysia is grouped in, averages an HDI of 0.477. Malaysia's HDI value in 2019 is 0.810, an improvement from 0.805 the year before. The score puts Malaysia in the very high human development category, together with two of our ASEAN neighbors, Singapore and Brunei Darussalam. In terms of ranking, Malaysia is placed 62 out of 189 countries and UN-recognized territories. Malaysia's performance in all HDI components are above the average for East Asia and the Pacific region, but are relatively lower than the average for the very high human development countries. Malaysia's life expectancy at birth for those born in 2019 is 76.2 years, compared to 79.6 years, the average for very high human development countries. Expected years of schooling means that a child of school entrance age can receive Expected years of schooling that a child of school entrance age can receive is 13.7 years. What this means is that on average, a child who starts school in 2019 can expect to get up to diploma level education. Whereas in very high development countries, the extra years means that on average, the child will be able to complete a college degree. Mean years of schooling represents the average number of years of education received by people aged 25 and older in 2019. For Malaysia, this is 10.4 years on average, of which translates into secondary year 4 or grade 10. So this brings into question whether our dropout rates after Form 3 is affecting this number. Countless studies have shown that equalizing opportunities for women and girls, promoting their economic, social, and political participation are good for the country. The report estimates HDI values separately for women and men. The closer the ratio to 1, the smaller the inequality gap between men and women. For Malaysia, the female HDI value for Malaysia is 0.797, in contrast to 0.821 for males. When dissected based on indicators, it is clear that the deviation is largely brought by the difference in GNI per capita between men and women, attributable to wage gap and also the lower labor force participation rate of females. This shows that within country inequalities in human development may be larger. For instance, as shown here, where women face larger achievement gaps in the workforce. Ladies and gentlemen, the 2020 Human Development Report introduces a new experimental lens to its Human Development Index. By adding 2 new metrics, carbon dioxide emissions and material footprint, the new index shows how the global development landscape changes when you consider the well-being of people alongside planetary pressures. The results are stark. No country is currently achieving very high achievement without straining planetary systems. In this region, we see that Singapore and Brunei's HDI scores are severely affected when adjusted for planetary measures. Both countries are small geographically, have highly open economies with high income per capita, and a structural dependence on hydrocarbons for energy or revenue. Similar to Malaysia, we import or export, the 3 countries are involved in importing or exporting, refining crude oil as feedstock for large petrochemical industries. On the other hand, low and medium human development countries have been able to improve social and economic conditions substantially without a high burden on planetary pressures, such as Cambodia and Myanmar. Their small adjustment factor can be attributed to the structure of the economy and their rates of resource use and resource efficiency. Malaysia aims to break away from these unsustainable development models, where high emission levels are unavoidable byproducts of economic growth. This is done by having underlying policy frameworks that are supportive of renewable energy and climate change mitigation efforts. In the 10th and 11th Malaysian plans, substantial national resources have been allocated to enhance a wide range of actions to address climate change. These actions are further complemented by the international communities in terms of capacity building, technical and financial support to fulfill the country's obligations under the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. Mitigation projects in the past and ongoing include aspects of energy efficiency in buildings, manufacturing, industrial and transport sectors. Other focus areas include clean and green technologies and low carbon cities development. The National RED Plus strategy provides a framework to conserve Malaysia's forests, sink and biodiversity. This strategy forms part of the RED Plus requirement under the UNFCCC to access results-based payments. Institutionalization of ecological fiscal transfer through policy, legal or administrative reform of existing fiscal transfer mechanisms in Malaysia. UNDP works include provision of policy papers detailing lessons from comparative analysis of EFT practices in countries such as Brazil, India, and Portugal, identifying opportunities and recommendations from legal feasibility and policy assessment perspectives. But still, our performance as a country could be better. Carbon dioxide emissions produced as a consequence of human activities, which is from the use of coal, oil, and gas for combustion and industrial processes, gas flaring and cement manufacture, divided by the country's mid-year population. So for the tech people, they would like to know the definition clearly. Malaysia produces 8.1 tons per capita compared to Sweden 4.1 or Sri Lanka 1.1. Material footprint is the attribution of global material extraction to meet domestic final demand of a country. It involves material footprint for biomass, fossil fuel, metal ores, and non-metal ores. So how far has these elements gone outside or inflow or outflow from the economy, from the country? Malaysia's material footprint is 24.2 tons per capita, compared to 4.4 in Philippines or 2.4 in Bangladesh. Latest data picked up in the HDR 2019 showed that Malaysia's total energy consumption from fossil fuels still stands very high at 96.6%. Ladies and gentlemen, the latest Human Development Report argues that we need nothing short of a great transformation to flourish in the next frontier of human progress. The human development approach has much to contribute in addressing our collective paralysis in the face of alarming planetary change. Human development is about expanding human freedoms and opening more choices for people to chart their own development paths. But in pursuing this, let us reject the idea that we must choose between trees and people. Humans are part of nature, not separated from it. The earth is the foundation of human life and progress. There is simply no choice to make. We save both people and trees, or we save neither. Collectively, we can pursue solutions embedded in changing social norms, improving incentives, and working with instead of against nature. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Haniza Khalid, for a very concise and important presentation. Before we begin our panel discussion, I would like to ask a favor from the participants. For the Zoom participants, you can answer the questions that appear on your screen monitor right now. As for the Facebook viewers, you are welcome to answer the questions in the comment section. Question 1. Between COVID-19 and climate change, which do you think is the larger threat to achieving the desired level human development in Malaysia by 2030? A. COVID-19, B. Climate change, C. Unsure. Question 2. Will pursuing environmental sustainability contribute to advancing social equality? A. Yes, social and environmental justice go hand in hand. B. Not necessarily. Social and environmental justice are largely driven by different factors. C. No, social and environmental justice compete for limited resources and attention. Thank you to everyone that participated. So sorry for that. Moving on, we'll begin our first panel discussion for today titled Human Development and the Anthropocene. I would like to pass the stage to the moderator for this discussion, Mr. Alizan Mahadi, Director of Research from Institute of Strategic and International Studies, Malaysia. Mr. Alizan, please take the floor.
Thank you. Yang Berhormat Mr. Khairy bin Jamaluddin, Mr. Nilo Banerjee, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Forum on Human Development and the Anthropocene as part of the launch of the UNDP's Human Development Report for 2020. First of all, thank you, UNDP, for inviting me today and congratulate them for successfully launching the Human Development Report for 2020. Now, the HDR, Human Development Report, has been a driving force in thinking and rethinking ideas on development over the past few years. I think we've heard it since 1990. Now, when the Human Development Index was established, the Human Development, or the HDI, I think the key idea was to go beyond the one indicator to rule them all, which is the GDP. Here, the idea was to shift the idea of development to look beyond economic income and go to issues such as health, education, and so on. So in this context, I think the focus on Anthropocene this year is very apt and very timely. As we all know, we have been going through a global pandemic, a global crisis, which is COVID-19. And from this global pandemic, we have seen the interconnections between human development and nature at large. When we talk about Anthropocene, I think we've heard earlier that we're talking about humans as the dominant force in shaping the future of the planet. And in this case, I think COVID-19 has really demonstrated that in one way. COVID-19 was linked, or nature was linked to the cause of COVID-19 itself. I think we will hear about that later within our panel. But also, when there were huge lockdowns imposed across the world, we have seen actually the scale of human activity and the impacts to the environment and to nature. For example, in the context of Malaysia and even globally, we have seen better air quality, cleaner rivers, and so on. So we can see that human activity impacts the nature, impacts the environment in a large scale. And this is real evidence after going through the pandemic and the imposed lockdowns. However, we also must admit that these shutdowns, these lockdowns, and the pandemic itself has come at an economic cost as well. So this is the broad question we are asking today. How do we balance the need for human development with the need to protect the environment as well? And to discuss this broad topic, we are lucky to have with us three very eminent panelists, of which I do not need to have lengthy introductions because they are really the equivalent to rock stars in this field. Firstly, we have Tan Sri Zakri Abdul Hamid, who was formerly the Science Advisor to the Prime Minister and is currently the Chairman of Atri Advisory. And he's really a champion at the global, regional, and national level in terms of issues such as biodiversity and sustainable development. He's a dear mentor to myself and countless of people, both in Malaysia and even globally. Secondly, we have Dr. Jomo Kwame Sundram, who is currently a research advisor at Kazanah Research Institute, and also I think I do not have to have lengthy introductions of him, as he is literally a giant in this field, and his thought leadership has inspired many of us, again, within the country and globally. Last but not least, we have Madam Gan Pek Chuan, who is the Program Manager of Biodiversity and Sustainable Development at the United Nations Development Program, Country Office for Malaysia, Singapore, and Brunei Darussalam, and she has been really at the front lines of mainstreaming the idea of environment, sustainable development in governments across the region. With that, I'll begin with a broad question to all our panelists, starting with Tan Sri Zakri. I think from the start of this session, there was a bit of confusion on what this concept of Anthropocene meant. I think the UNDP has even done a video on this. Perhaps from the context of Malaysia as well, Tan Sri, can you please begin from your point of view? What do you understand by this concept of Anthropocene and linking it to human development? Tan Sri?
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for giving me the floor to address this gathering. It's a very timely moment. Let me outright respond to your question on what Anthropocene means really. So You know, in schools, we were once told that humans could never match the prevailing geological forces. But today, especially during the last half a century, through our destructive activities, we have changed the chemistry of our atmosphere, causing glaciers to melt, sea levels to rise, species to go extinct, and severe weather events such as floods, droughts, and hurricanes to increase, hence climate change. So that is in essence what Anthropocene means. Human activities over the last half a century. Let me draw your attention to some of the recent findings. Last year, the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, IPBES, released a benchmark report saying that 1 million species are under threat, and 60% of the ecosystem services that we humans depend on are being degraded. So that is the consequence of this Anthropocene, you know, it's just so scary. Let me end this segment by relating some personal experience. I've been in the international debate since more than 35 years ago. That's within the Anthropocene age. I used to negotiate on behalf of Malaysia the Convention on Biodiversity. That's about 30 years ago, 1990 to the 1992. I was involved in preparation for the Rio Summit or the Earth Summit, the World Summit on Sustainable Development in Johannesburg in 2002, and so on, culminating in the summit in 2015 that resulted in the 2030 development agenda. So ladies and gentlemen, there's a lot of discussion, there's a lot of debates, there's a lot of polemics in this. It's not that the world is not unaware. And the political masters, I think, tried their best, but practically we are not there. For instance, the issue of climate change is well known. The issue on biodiversity loss, we tried several times to halt biodiversity loss. The impact is still not there. Just to bring you up to speed, earlier this year, well, in September, during the UN Summit on Biodiversity, for instance, there's a leaders' pledge for nature. There are almost 200 countries in the world, in the UN system, but barely 100 leaders took that pledge. It's the same thing for being members of the High Ambition Coalition, you know, chaired by France and Costa Rica. That is still not being taken up globally. So just to conclude, I think what is missing here is the political will, you know? And don't blame just the politician. The experts, the scientists, need to come down and explain to our political leaders, our policymakers, why it's very necessary for us to translate rhetoric into action. So the Human Development report released now, I think, is a significant part of that conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Tan Sri. And I think we can all agree there that the rhetoric has been there since perhaps the 1970s, Tan Sri, that aims to connect environment and the development. But as we have heard today, unfortunately, there is no country that has had very high human development status that does not contribute to planetary pressure. So here we really need to transition from the rhetoric level into action, and I hope the forum today will also zoom in onto this. Can I also invite Dr. Jomo to respond in terms of the understanding Anthropocene, and more from perhaps from a human development context. I'm sure, Dr. Jomo, you have been following the process of human development reports of HDI in the past. How do you see the Anthropocene in its connection with human development? Welcome, Dr. Jomo. Please share your thoughts.
Participate in this. My task is made easier by Tan Sri Zakri's preceding comments. I've known Tan Sri Zakri for at least 4 decades since we were students together in the 1970s. Let me emphasize that, frankly, I feel uncomfortable with the title of this report, the Anthropocene. As has been emphasized, it is a geological term. And geology, unfortunately, is not seen as a life science. And I would have been much more comfortable with a reference, for example, to nature or to sustainability, which is really the challenge. But I think all of us are usually under pressure to come up with a report with a new title and so on and so forth. And sometimes, unfortunately, titles can be misleading. So, for instance, if you have we talk about Industrial Revolution 4.0 as if there's something terribly novel about it. When you talk about digitization or artificial intelligence, it has been with us at least since the 1980s. So it is really this search for novelty, which is unfortunate. But I think the key point of the report, and I spent a bit of time reading the report yesterday, and it is really a very good report, and I must commend the UNDP and the authors of the report for a very, very fine job. And I think what really needs to be emphasized is how we deal and address nature. One of the problems of framing it within a human development context, the human development approach as pioneered by people like Mahbub Haq and Amartya Sen, basically emphasizes the whole question of human capabilities, human will, and it basically comes from a paradigm which is essentially liberal. And the idea that human actions will somehow other magically be in the best interest of humanity. Unfortunately, that's not the case, as we know. And we know this all too well. There are so many so-called trade-offs which we need to deal with, and we need to deal with, for example, the difficult choices. And unfortunately, it is for many people in the world, improvement of personal well-being, or family well-being, and so on and so forth, is much more important, and perhaps collectively. So this idea of well-being is often seen in a short-termist context, and quite understandably so, particularly, for example, for people living through livelihood challenges as during COVID-19. So I think it is very important for us to recognize that there is a need to recognize that in the individual will and the collective wills themselves are not necessarily going to solve our problems. And this is part of the challenge which we face in dealing with the whole question of human development. But let me stop here, Alizan. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Jomo. If I can follow up a bit on and elaborate more, because when you talk about human development, and especially in this context, as you mentioned, from Amartya Sen and Mahbub Haq and so on, we talk about expanding freedoms, we talk about expanding choices, but how do you reconcile that in terms of the limits that we have in terms of our natural resources, in terms of the environment, in terms of the planetary boundaries that we have in terms of development? So do you think we need to reframe human development in this context? Your thoughts, Dr. Jomo?
Thank you, Alizan. That was what I was basically hinting at when I said that from a liberal approach, this is hugely problematic. I think relying on individuals alone to discipline themselves in the collective interest of society, or even more challenging, in the collective interest of sustainability, is not an easy thing. So this is where I think we really need to begin to question the liberal framework, and to begin to recognize that, as we find in many religions, you have the question of rights going with the question of responsibilities. the challenge, of course, is how do we define our responsibilities? And these responsibilities are not difficult, are not easy to define, and not easy to agree to collectively. And I think this is part of the challenge. I mean, for example, we have a situation in Kedah right now where they claim that there is Asian rare earths which have been discovered precisely in the water catchment area, which will, if mined, which is likely to undermine not only the source of water for the entire Muda scheme, but also very important potable water for Kedah and Penang. This is a huge issue. At the same time, you have the possibility of incomes which arguably might benefit some of the people in the area. So I think there are very, very difficult challenges involved, and I think we cannot talk about these issues out beyond the system. And this is precisely why I think it is extremely important that we begin to interrogate this so-called human development paradigm. As useful as it is, it poses very serious problems in terms of how we try to reconcile the questions of sustainability with the question of realizing the human potential in terms of developing human capabilities and human freedoms. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Jomo. Before I pass to Ms. Gan, perhaps Tan Sri Zakri, would you like to also have some views in terms of this framing of development in the context of the Anthropocene?
Yes, very much. I would also agree with Jomo with all that he said. In particular, when he asked, how do we define responsibility, you know? And in Malaysia alone, look at the ongoings. I'm not a politician, but I like to watch the political sort of activities. When they were debating the 2021 debate last week and this week, how much have you heard the concept of planetary responsibility?
I don't think I have.
There's none at all. You know, it's all politics. And when Jomo mentioned about the Kedah government intent to mine this rare earth, I agree with him. We need to be very careful. You know, money is not the only thing. The watershed alone is a good reason why we should be more careful. But at the same time, I must confess here, I look highly last month. You know, during the deliberation at the Selangor State Assembly, when the question about this Kuala Langat forest reserve of being de-gazetted, the thinking of the government, both aisles of the assembly, the government and the opposition, unanimously took the decision not to de-gazette that area. So it shows a lot of understanding there. The only thing is the jury is still out because it's up to the Menteri Besar to eventually decide to de-gazette or not. But the fact that the whole legislature is up in arms is, I think, an excellent one.
So we have seen progress there, in terms of the political will, in terms of even bipartisanship in that sense.
Exactly.
When we talk about these issues. Ms. Gunn, we're sticking to this idea of framing this human development and the Anthropocene. Perhaps you've been working a lot with government, etc. Is it something that is resonant to policymakers, do you think? Or is it something like Dr. Jomo was saying, perhaps, that we need to rethink in some ways? Ms. Gunn?
Compare that both Professor Tan Sri Zakri and also, you know, Dr. Jomo as rock star, then there will be the struggling musician, you know, still working at the nightclub level.
Not at all.
Yeah. Yes. Just sharing my own experience working with UNDP and also, in close collaborations with different agencies at different, at 3 tiers of, federal, state, and also local government. I can say that at the federal level, because of their exposure and experience in global environmental treaties, or conventions, definitely they are more in tune in terms of laying down different policies or even strategies. This can be seen in our 5-year development planning and the respective sectoral policies. But if you go down further to state level, or we call subnational level, these capacity may not be on par with what we see the capacity at the federal. And unfortunately, you go further down to local government, this resonates very little, to the day-to-day, responsibilities or even functionalities of local government. So how do we bridge the gap? Which I also think, as we are moving into, this era of Anthropocene. Personally, I also doesn't agree that because Anthropocene is a geological, destination of an era. Although I do agree that we have entering a time, our time, where human, activities has caused a lot of adverse impacts to the planet or Earth that we are living into for the past 10,000 or over years. Which means that humans now are both the culprits and also the victims, of our actions because of the pressures that we have exerted onto the planet Earth. So are our institutions set up, our current institutional setup, able to address these issues? This is not as clear-cut as, as the usual rule of law that we see. We pick, whoever commit a crime, who violates the law, so they get penalty, well, we're going to protect the victims. But now we are now both the culprits and the victims. So how do we have the kind of institutional setup or the policy trajectory that can steer us towards, addressing the adversity of climate change or the mass extinction that we've seen in loss of biodiversity and ecosystem services? Let's take an example of, the natural choice of institution when we address this kind of environmental problems will be the Ministry of Environment. Of course, in our current structure, that will be the Ministry of Energy and Natural Resources and Ministry of Water and Environment. And these two ministries has gone through a lot of evolution over the years. The first Ministry of Environment, or ministry that has the functions of environment, started back in 1976 with the Ministry of Science, Technology and Environment. And it gone through a few iterations over the years. In 2004, ultimately we have one mega ministry, which called the Ministry of Natural Resources and Environment, who's supposed to take on, all the environmental sustainability. They are the forerunner, they are supposed to, advocate the issues, dealing with politicians, hope there will be a change of mindset. But still, and then until now, then we move on to another mega ministry, which has the longest name in the history of our ministry. I think it's called MESTEC. Then, of course, now we have these ministries broken up into two again. So are these institutional changes that we see, from 1976 until, 2020, help Malaysia or support Malaysia, to navigate the kind of human, impacts onto the environment, or navigate the kind of, social economic systems that are based and anchor on, the boundaries or planetary boundaries that we always say, the terms that we ecologists or environmentalists use. But if you cross-reference with the trends that we have in Malaysia, what is our performance? We lose our rhino. It's extinct already, our rhino. And carbon dioxide emissions is on the rise, not decreasing. We are continuing to have more and more species in the red list of IUCN. So, of course, it's not fair to correlate, these kind of trends, ecological trends, against the ministerial or institutional setup that we have. But it does gives you an indication that something may not be right. And it's time for us to consider, rethink the institutions beyond a static institutional model. I will just stop here.
Thank you, Ms. Gunn. And I think in terms of the outcome within the HDI, if I read correctly, when we add the planetary pressures, Malaysia actually goes down by 18 spots in terms of the rankings, and therefore that does indicate something. At the same time, you have to also acknowledge that other countries also differ in terms of performance when the planetary is incorporated. But you've raised something very important there in terms of hinting at institutional change and also systems change. I think it was also highlighted earlier in Mr. Niloy Banerjee's opening remarks, in that many of the solutions that we talk about are singular solutions, and here the HDR report advocates really looking at systems-wide change. And Tansi Zakri, I think you have been advocating, for example, a Green New Deal for Malaysia, because previously a lot of interventions have always been piecemeal, have always been very focused on perhaps sectorally, but Green New Deal should be a bit more comprehensive. Tansi, would you like to speak a bit about the need for Green New Deal for Malaysia?
Very much. In fact, we have sort of no choice but to look at the so-called Green New Deal. It was an idea which was championed by the UN itself when Achim Steiner was the executive director of the UN Environment Program. But somehow with the interests of the US and Europe, this concept gained traction. In fact, Malaysia, in bits and pieces, have been adopting those green deals. What we don't have is a concerted national policy on the new Green Deal, taking into account what are being proposed by those people outside, but taking into account our own strength. For instance, the knowledge residing in indigenous groups, in the local communities, I think is a very strong element to incorporate in any consideration of the new Green Deal. Of course, eventually going through renewables, which we have been undertaking, is also a good one. And the fact that corporate like Petronas adopting this net zero ambition is good. But it's not easy, of course. But eventually, I think the people have to be brought in. It is not only the government's side, but the people on the street must appreciate concepts like reduce, reuse, and recycle. And in that context, coming back to the issue of governance, I'm also very hopeful that the so-called parliamentary standing committee, which has been formed from the last government and to this government, are good, because it would promote healthy dialogue between the citizens, the experts, and also the parliamentarians. Only, unfortunately, again, in that current parliamentary standing committee, environment is not there somehow. So for people like me is quite disappointing.
Thank you. Tan Sri, when we talk about the Green New Deal, I think we have to also speak to Dr. Jomo, who is also one of the thought leaders in Green New Deal globally, I believe. And also you mentioned before, Dr. Jomo, about perhaps when we talk about systems change, the need to rethink also the neoliberal economic paradigm as well. So please share some thoughts in terms of how the Green New Deal perhaps can provide a systems change. Dr. Jomo?
Yes, thank you very much again. Let me emphasize that around the same time as the idea of a Green New Deal was being promoted by UNEP, we in the United Nations Secretariat at that time were promoting the idea of a global Green New Deal. And let me try to emphasize to you what I believe to be the difference. The major difference, I think, was on the recognition that many of the proposals which were coming up for the developed countries involve things like carbon pricing, raising the cost of carbon, etc., to try to deter or reduce the use of fossil fuels. Our own view was that for developing countries, there were over 1 billion people in the world at that time who did not even have access to electricity. And to tell them that no, we cannot advance electrification because it's going to emit fossil fuels, to me was a betrayal of the idea of development, of sustainable development. You cannot have, you cannot trade it off in that fashion. So our commitment at that time was to try to promote the idea of getting the rich countries who had failed, by the way, to meet their commitments under the Kyoto Protocol to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. When that failed, we took the view that the way to do it is for the rich countries to subsidize the poor countries to modernize, to electrify. So that you would not deprive them, and you would undertake a variety of measures to enable them. So you do not deprive poor people, especially in poor countries, but also elsewhere, of development, of improving their well-being. But at the same time, you bypass the fossil fuel stage of generating electricity and go straight to renewables. We thought that it was possible, as you all know, since the middle of the 1990s, the price of photovoltaic solar panels, electricity has remained very, very low. And of course, wind turbines, where appropriate, are also relatively low. Of course, there are certain costs which need to be taken into consideration, but all this was possible. But you needed to help the poor countries from doing so. You cannot just say, oh, let's impose a tax as if the effects will be the same on everybody. So we promoted this idea, and when the global financial crisis happened, this idea was the Secretary General at that time wrote an editorial which promoted this idea. And Gordon Brown, who was going to host the second G20 summit, actually promised to advance the idea. He eventually came to see us and said, you're asking for $1 trillion. That's a bit too much. Please stop talking about it. But eventually he raised 1.1 trillion. But the 1.1 trillion mostly went to the IMF, where he had been the chairman of the IMFC before that, with a little bit going to others as well, and next to nothing for sustainable development. So I feel, the problem which Tan Sri Zakri emphasized of politicians, commitment to sustainable development being, wafer thin, is a huge problem, and we need to be able to find ways and means to hold people to the fire, to make the necessary sacrifices in order for us to progress. If we do not recognize that there are trade-offs involved, I don't think we're going to get very far. This is why modern economic thinking is hugely problematic. Last night I was listening to a discussion going on in Cambridge about the whole idea of natural capital. And this idea was advanced over a decade ago by the World Bank, as if you can you can convert natural capital to physical capital to human capital interchangeably. It's all interchangeable. This is a hugely problematic ideas. And so in the search for novelty of ideas, we often run into hugely problematic ideas. Very often traditional ideas, old ideas are actually quite relevant. I mean, before the advent of economics, before Adam Smith, there was the idea of physiocracy. The term came from plant physiology, and looking at the growth of paying much more attention to nature. Of course, many of those ideas may not be appropriate today, but I think there was far greater attention to the natural world in an earlier age, in the pre-industrial age, than is currently the case. And we need to begin to realize the limitations of our thinking, and this is part of the problem. I mean, you look, for example, at the recent problem with education of our children. Less than 10% of children actually have access to devices to enable them to do online learning. We could have done much better job by using more traditional means such as radio and television instead of relying on such devices. And so we have children who have lost 8 months of education, 9 months of education unnecessarily because of choices, public policy choices which were made, which could have been very different because of the search for modernity, wanting to be part of the digital age rather than an earlier electronic age, and so on and so forth. Let me stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Jomo. So in that sense as well, we see how ideas really matter in shaping the world as well. So in that sense, forums such as these are very important to really discuss in the context of Malaysia as well, which ideas work. So I think that's something that we really need to consider. And secondly, also, of course, the political will and the political dimension is brought up very strongly here to really catalyze some of the actions. And I think I would like to congratulate UNDP for the context of this Human Development Report. It really looks at these interconnections rather than ignoring them and looking at, for example, the environment as simply a natural science issue. And on that note as well, I think, Ms. Gan, you brought up the importance of institutional change. And when we talk about the new normal, it's not just about wearing masks, but when we look at the Anthropocene, the projections are that it's only, climate change is only going to have a larger impact in the world. The world's going to get hungrier, more interconnected, thirstier, and so on. So how do you see institutions that are able to adapt to this new normal of an age of crisis, if you like, Ms. Gan?
Yeah, I think generally, we have been constructing or building institutions. We maintain them, and we reorientate them based on lots of times based on political changes, socio-economic pressures, and sometimes, as Dr. Jomo rightly pointed out, sometimes chasing for new ideas, modernity, modernization of terminology. But very seldom institutions come back and reflect, the kind of the influence that can affect, on policy trajectory. I mean, this is particularly evident, in the earlier example that I've shared, with the case of ministries. So some may argue, the present structure of just having a Ministry of Environment looking into the sustainability issue is not sufficient. We propose to have whole of government approach, or even, perhaps, the central planning agencies should be, restructured or reoriented to become a sustainability, a structure or an organization should look into, interconnections of all these issues between humans and planets. Well, whether that will work, it requires a lot of internal reflection. And more importantly, I think in terms of this institutional discussion and conversation or discourse, it requires a larger, participation of society as a whole. Yeah. A lot of times when we set up new institutions, be it at the government or in other forms, we don't see a lot of community participation or even public participation in that discourse. But as we are moving into this time, I think there's a lot more, demand for that kind of participation, or involvement in the decision-making process. Because when there is a behavioral change at the people level, individual level, then only it can elevate into the institutional level and in turn put up the necessary or influence and pressures at the political level. Yeah. Which is why I think Prof. Zakri has mentioned, we need a political view, but sometimes a lot of political view requires influence, positive influence and pressures from the society, individuals and institutions.
Maybe, Tan Sri, on this political will, you've had such broad experiences both globally and domestically as well. Speaking truth to power, if you like, would you like to share the responses that you've had, perhaps on advocating biodiversity and so on, and how could this be expanded further?
Thank you. Can be on biodiversity, can be on any other subject like science, And talking to the powers that be, from my experience, is quite enriching and also surprising. Simply because if you talk to the politician or even the Prime Minister, his concern is quite simple, Could science provide solutions to two things which are high on his agenda? Number one, can science provide jobs? Jobs, more jobs. And this is a problem even today, Secondly, can this advice generate better well-being for the rakyat? In other words, better income for those makcik who sell nasi lemak or whatever, And it's very simple. So the proposed approach by advisors would be to meet these two needs, jobs and better human well-being. If you can develop that, then you are on your way home. The problem, as Ms. Gan also mentioned, the mechanism or the structure there, at least in Malaysia, is not well developed. It's not well developed. Where will you get this constant interaction, as you mentioned, between the knowledge generators like the scientific community talking to the policymakers or to the politicians and the NGOs, So if you can have that mechanism or multiple form of mechanism, I think we can do a lot to improve what is going on today.
Thank you, Tan Sri. Yes, the interface, as you would know, Tan Sri, as you've been leading globally as well, the science policy interface, but also interface with the communities are very essential to provide that platform. And now we have various instruments such as the Sustainable Development Goals to catalyze those platforms. So I think we can discuss that a bit more later, but it's something that definitely can continue. But you also raised something very important there, the kind of yardstick of progress in a way, job creation, wealth creation, and well-being. And this is something that is very important in the context of Human Development Index before, in terms of measuring progress. In terms of measuring progress, what is exactly the end goal, or for the HDI, is actually the means to get to the end goal of well-being. Here in the latest report, there is an addition in terms of material footprint, an addition in terms of, I think, carbon emissions as well, to look at the planetary component, planetary pressures component. Maybe here I can invite Dr. Jomo, your views in terms of this going beyond GDP to measure progress. Is it something that we really need to rethink, going beyond GDP, and in what form should it take? I would like to add here, there are also various indices here, for example, those measuring happiness. We all know Bhutan measures gross national happiness instead of GDP. So yes, Dr. Jomo, would you like to share your views on this topic?
Thank you, Alizan. I think there's a very interesting foreword written by Omoto Sen to the HDR, which I would encourage people interested in your question to read. He basically says two things, that although he appreciated the idea of human development, he was actually not very comfortable with the idea of the Human Development Index. And whereas Mahbub ul Haq took the view that the only way to displace GDP was to promote the idea of an alternative measure, as crude as it might be. And that was the justification for the birth of the Human Development Index. Frankly, 30 years ago, that might well have been that was the high tide of neoliberal thinking, at the time when Mrs. Thatcher and was still around, Mr. Reagan's ghost was still to be felt, and so on and so forth. But I think today, the president of France, more than a decade ago, commissioned Amartya Sen, Joseph Stiglitz, and a French economist to write a major report challenging this. And there have been so many reports which are challenging the idea of the GDP, the measurement involved, and so on and so forth. And frankly, very few people really are obsessed with it, except perhaps occasionally, a few people who head economic ministries. But looking at it very pragmatically, since you asked Tansi Zakri the question of politics, nobody really, ordinary people are not really excited about what the GDP numbers say. They are concerned about what it actually means for their life, the quality of the life. And thousands of people commented, for example, about how river life became improved so much during the COVID-19 MCO and so on and so forth. People began to hear birds again in urban areas and so on and so forth. People actually appreciate these other points in life. It's not just all about money and so on and so forth. But in Malaysia, for example, only about 30% of the population are in a position to save some of their income. The remaining 70% basically live a very tough life, paying bills all the time, and many of them are actually indebted. So life is a grind. So the measure of livelihoods in terms of these kinds of gross measures, including GDP, is really sort of over. That age is over. And it only matters perhaps for a few credit rating agencies and people like that. But for the vast majority of people, it really is over. And so what we really need to do is pay far more attention to human well-being. And that I think should be the focus of our efforts. Now, that in itself, however, doesn't address the problem of sustainability. And this is why we need the kinds of reminders of this report, of what people like Tansi Zakri have been talking about for years, and so on and so forth. We need a greater, broader sensibility. And this began, as Ms. Gunn correctly pointed out, in the mid-1970s, after the Stockholm Environment Summit of 1972, the 1974, I think it was, the government introduced the Environmental Protection Act, and then there was a whole chapter devoted to the environment in the 1976 third Malaysia Plan. So we have had this kind of reminders and recognition on the part of government, but unfortunately it is not significant enough. I mean, let's face it, we don't even have a Sustainable Development Institute in this country. Pakistan has had one since the 1990s, but we have not had any. Alizan, if I may say so, you know, you do your unit does very good work, but you're part of ISIS, which now is no longer under the Prime Minister's department, but under the Foreign Ministry. So it almost seems as if all this is for international, you know, rather than for the improvement of the well-being of Malaysians. And I think it is very important for us to have a mainstreaming, you know, if you will, of sustainable development, of human rights, and so on and so forth. They should not be prerogatives, things to be done by the Foreign Ministry, but it should really involve the whole of government. All of government should be involved and paying attention to questions of human rights, of sustainability, of sustainable development more generally. And that really is an all-encompassing way of trying to understand human progress, I think, in this day and age.
Thank you, Dr. Jomo. I think you brought up, you know, many very good points. Firstly, in terms of the human well-being, especially during this COVID-19, the improvement in terms of air quality, water quality in some areas as well, is the best indicator. It's the best indicator rather than your hard figures and so on of human well-being. And in that sense, for the society, for the people, that is what matters. It's something that they can see, they can feel, and they can touch. But on the other hand, some of the challenges are also future challenges that requires science input, etc. And this is where it is important that this idea of mainstreaming comes to place. And I think in this, before we go to question and answers, it's quite important to discuss moving forward the solutions. And we'll start there, I think, in terms of mainstreaming. When we talk about mainstreaming, I think there needs to be empowerment, needs to be innovation. Perhaps Ms. Gunn, you've been working, I think, very hard, especially in terms of mainstreaming policy over the years. Can you share your thoughts on the process of mainstreaming and what are the barriers and challenges moving forward in terms of mainstreaming really across the whole of government?
I think, you know, one of the main challenges, I would say, against mainstreaming, I would just take the biodiversity as an example. So, as you know, we are now into the second generation of a policy, national policy on biological diversity for the duration of 2016 to 2025. Until now, you still can see there's not much, you know, awareness and understanding of this policy, particularly, you know, at the state government level or even local government level. If you even move beyond that government space, and you just, you know, perhaps just grab a normal citizen, you know, in Malaysia, and ask, are you aware of these policies? I doubt anyone would know that either. But in there, you have a lot of, you know, some targets. Targets of 20% coverage of terrestrial protected areas, or even at least 10%, you know, of marine protected areas. But the policy has been introduced for the past 5 years, but it never moved beyond the Ministry of Energy and Natural Resources. Why? I mean, the challenges is just because we didn't do enough advocacy or communication, or because we didn't, you know, put it as part of the syllabus into the school for children. Not to mention, but somehow I still see some hope, because 2 years ago, we had the opportunity to work with the Ministry of Finance in the preparation of the budget 2019. Surprisingly, as you know, Ministry of Finance is not your traditional ministries that will talk about environment. But they approached UNDP and asked, would you be able to give us a policy paper on ecological fiscal transfer? Yeah. So as you know, ecological fiscal transfer is just one of the form of intergovernmental fiscal transfer. From federal to state, or even from federal to local government. So it's not new in Malaysia. It's in our federal constitution. So in the form of road capitation grant. Only thing is ecological, as it means that these fiscal transfers of funds from federal to states is based on ecological indicators and criteria. So we prepare 6 pages of policy paper, with some recommendations that you have done. So what we've seen is there was an announcement of 60 million ringgit Malaysia, 60 million ringgit Malaysia as allocation, even though it's not worded in such a way that is an ecological fiscal transfer. But it was a good start, saying that these 60 million will be transferred to the state government for the efforts in protected area management and also conservation and natural forests. So you can say that was like a kickstart. Then of course for budget 2020 there's a gap, there's no such allocation. But it was back in now in budget for 2021. With a very specific reference to ecological fiscal transfer, where it says, ringgit Malaysia 70 million, so a slight increase. And then they actually, because in order for a Ministry of Finance to do it, to introduce it, rather than going through a more lengthy process of, a better sets of formula, how to calculate the fiscal transfer like you have in Brazil or even in some countries like Portugal. So they have allocated it under the, they call grant. They call tahap. That means you give it to the state government based on the level of economic development, infrastructure, and well-being. I would say this is a good start. And a good start because Ministry of Finance is one of the core ministry and is not your traditional ministries that talks about environment, but they already have showing signs of a mindset change, that realizing the importance of the environment and is reflecting into the annual budgetary process.
Thank you, Ms. Gan. We're going to proceed to Q&A from the viewers. But before that, just this important question on mainstreaming quickly, Tan Sri. In terms of the mainstreaming of science, I think in an age of information or unfortunately maybe recently an age of disinformation that has been occurring across the world, hopefully that will potentially change with the change of presidents in the United States perhaps. But in terms of the challenges in terms of mainstreaming science, Tan Sri, your views on?
Yes, science, climate change, or biodiversity. The problem, as Ms. Chan mentioned, why is it not much in mainstream? I think one of the reasons for this is because we are not able to make it a popular item, something which people like to hear every day. So maybe one of the approaches is to identify champions. And it's not champions like me or Jomo or Ms. Chan, or maybe yourself, Alizan, because you're younger, but engaging popular figures, singers like Zainal, who used to have a song on the environment, Einstein, or even Maya Karen. We don't have that. Because you remember, for the climate change, it became popular, it became mainstream globally when Al Gore joined forces with the IPCC. And to make a long story short, they were awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. Just a short comment here. Last week I was involved with the British High Commissioner to popularize Malaysian biodiversity. And it was so interesting because Ambassador Hay is trying to highlight some of the nature gems in Malaysia. You name it, you know, the 130 million old rainforests, those Langkawi Geopark and all that. But they are doing that on our behalf. And Malaysia has so much story, you know, in terms of natural history. One of the co-founders of the theory of natural selection by Charles Darwin is Alfred Russel Wallace in 1856, doing work in Malaysia and coming up with the same principle. He's a co-founder of that, but we were never able to cash in on this mainstream. But as you see, there's still hope.
Thank you, Tan Sri. So we need to engage real rock stars beyond the fields rather than just within our fields. Okay, I'm just going to open up for question and answers from those joining online. I think we have a few. First, I have a question for Tan Sri Zakri and Dr. Jomo. The question is, state government needs income from logging. How do we then advise government to stop logging and yet be able to sustain financially? And I think this is a very important question considering the current situation as well during the economic recovery period of COVID-19. Maybe I'll ask Dr. Jomo first. Dr. Jomo?
Yes, I think it's important for us to recall that although natural resources are prerogatives of state governments, there have been two instances where these prerogatives were transferred. The first was, of course, the Petroleum Development Act. And with the Petroleum Development Act, it became the federal government which basically had authority, of course, with certain, with some revenue sharing with the state governments and so on and so forth. And the second, of course, was the establishment of the National Forestry Council by Prime Minister Mahathir, I think around the 1980s. And basically, first in Peninsular Malaysia and subsequently in Sabah, large-scale logging basically came to an end. Much of the logging which continues right now has been relatively small-scale logging, which is often, some of which is of course illegal. And some of it was supposedly in connection with land development, but now we find that a lot of land development schemes have basically been given up. I mean, land development for agricultural purposes. So I think what we have right now are precedents where the federal government can assert itself vis-a-vis the state government. Unfortunately, the exception in states which I've mentioned has been Sarawak. And now that pretty much you've logged out almost all of Sarawak, at least the accessible part of Sarawak, we find that that revenues have come down from logging itself. And now there is this renewed efforts by the state authorities to get more for petroleum. Unfortunately, the damage has already been done to Peninsular Malaysia, to Sabah and Sarawak. And the few cases which are going on in places like Kelantan and Perak possibly have been due to state governments sort of ignoring federal guidelines. Now, I think it is important for signals to be sent, but when you do not have a strong federal authority, which unfortunately happens to be the case right now, it is very unlikely that you're going to have assert federal control over the state authorities. Also, you also have a tremendously powerful lobbyists, not only for example, for logging, but you also have, for example, for mining, for rare earth mining, as we saw in the case of Pahang with the rare earth mining which is going on there. So we have a lot of lobbyists who are undermining environmental commitments all the time. And we have to recognize that this is part of the problem, that a prioritization given to enabling business and so on and so forth. Many of us who have been active internationally have been campaigning against this. For example, the World Bank's Doing Business report. It is the most popular report, but it is actually has been doing a lot of damage. And a lot of the justification in terms of economic theory, in terms of talking about, oh, we destroy natural capital, but we are developing physical capital and human capital. All that is really bogus. It's not as if these things are possible to replace. But we find that unfortunately a lot of antiquated and false economic thinking is actually based on this. Another big problem, at least in my own profession in economics, is the tendency to draw analogies, particularly with physics. Of course, there are a few exceptions. People are drawing more and more analogies recently with biology. But the analogy with physics basically assumes life, other forms of life doesn't matter. And this is why I'm not comfortable with the use of the term Anthropocene as a summary way of capturing the problems of sustainability and so on. It is true, for example, I think there was a report a couple of weeks ago that the built environment now physically outweighs the natural environment. I don't know whether this is true, but of course a lot of the built environment comes from mineral resources. And it is very likely that this is true, but that in and of itself does not help us to understand. And ultimately, sustainability is about the life sciences. I don't need to persuade Tan Sri Zakri, who comes from that background himself. But and maybe this whole thing. Mr. Moderator, your reference to us as rock stars is a joke. Here we are measuring life in terms of geological ages, rather than in terms of biological ages. But more seriously, I think we have a serious problem with the very way in which we think. We are prioritizing the latest fads, the latest trends. And thinking about whatever the latest fads which are being discussed in the West, in New York, in Washington, in London, in Davos, rather than looking at our own problems and our own challenges, and of course with reference to many of the discussions which are happening internationally, but having a greater, deeper sense of the problems which we face in our own country. Thank you.
Tansi, would you like to comment on this issue of logging at the state level?
First, I would just agree again with Jomo that we should have a greater presence in the discussion of local issues, and that includes a lot, and it can also relate to logging, which is quite depleting now, but the way to go is, at the risk of being cliche, to find ways on sustainable logging, if there's such a term for it. But this is really as opposed to clear-cut felling with selective tree cutting, It has been tried before. The other one that the state authorities may wish to look into, as I mentioned to you earlier about this interests of the British, is about ecotourism. We can do a lot on ecotourism. One country which we could emulate would be Costa Rica, which has reduced its logging or even zero logging, but they have really gone in a big way into ecotourism. Their forests, their marine areas. And Malaysia is not short of it. Like, for instance, off the coast of Terengganu, there are 5 islands there, Redang, Tenggol, and a few others, which are now the so-called protected areas. But what the state government could look into is how to promote conservation of those islands, its marine biodiversity, for instance, but promoting ecotourism, giving jobs to the poor, extra job to the poor fishermen, and also developing activities, agriculture, horticulture, for instance, during those monsoon season when they are at home. You know. So there are many ways that they can look into.
Thank you, Tan Sri. And as you mentioned, the idea of ecotourism is again at the heart of this method of moving away from singular solutions. You know, it generates income, it generates social well-being, as well as protecting the environment as well. Okay, moving on to the next question. I'll hand this over to Ms. Gunn. In this country, there is so little understanding among politicians about the intersectionality of gender issues, health, social justice, nature, climate change, etc. We have been talking of the symptoms rather than the cause for so many years. How do we advance given the report of the situation remains? Ms. Gunn?
Well, Malaysia can take inspiration from the report. We may not be fully agree, with how the Human Development Index, as you know, all indices has its own pros and cons. But we can take inspiration, at least some inspiration from the report that there is a need for more engagement with our policymakers at the parliamentary level. I still remember there is a particular policy actions in the National Policy on Biological Diversity that we will, support the setup of an environmental caucus in the parliament. Yeah, I mean, our parliament already have some committees, that looks into finances, I think, and all that. So would that be, a better, it's time for us to have a specific committee or caucus for dealing with environment or even sustainability issue, to be exact, that deals with all these interface of social well-being, health, economics, and nature, as a form, or as a structure to have our politicians to be more, more aware and understand, the interconnection of these issues. But I must say, over the years we have seen there are some very promising, policymakers. They are willing to think beyond, some of their own, politicians' life cycle. Think about more about these issues rather than whatever that you have within the constraints of a political system.
Thank you, Ms. Gunn. We've only have about 10 minutes left. Before we end, I think we've heard quite a lot in terms of, especially regarding the need for change at the systemic level, especially there's been questions, also comments brought up, especially political will. There's been many ideas being floated, and the argument that these ideas matter, even though they may be antiquated and even wrong ideas, and they have been very influential to our current situation. So I think I'm going to give the floor to the panelists to wrap up their own comments. But before that, I think I'll let one more question here. So if you can, if all the panelists can respond to this question and then give your concluding remarks. So the final question I have is, what would a Malaysian Green New Deal look like? Do you think the government is committed towards post-COVID green recovery? Are the allocations towards environmental sustainability in budget 2021 sufficient? So perhaps the panelists can respond to this question and provide your final remarks. I'll begin with Tan Sri Zakri, if you can respond.
Yes, the Malaysian Green New Deal should have nature as its underpinning. Secondly, it must be a situation where citizens are conscious of sustainable development, and they would carry on their life with this nature-friendly approach or concept, But before I leave, I want to quote Anthony Guterres. I think he made this remark 1 week ago when he says, humans were waging a suicidal war on planet Earth. He warned that unless efforts were stepped up, the fires, floods, and cyclones would become the new normal. And he said, nature always strikes back with gathering force and fury. So all nations, in particular ours, we must gather around a goal of reducing greenhouse gas emission and also look at biodiversity loss. Thank you.
Thank you, Tan Sri. Dr. Jomo, would you also like to respond to the question and provide your closing remarks? Once again, what would a Malaysian Green New Deal look like? Do you think the government is committed towards post-COVID green recovery and other allocations towards environmental sustainability in Budget 2021 sufficient? Dr. Jomo?
Thank you. Before trying to respond to the question, allow me to respond to what Tan Sri Zakri just said, quoting our former colleague Antonio Guterres. You see, the Secretary General of the United Nations is making a comment about the way we have looked at science and history and progress in terms of man's conquest, its mastery of nature. If we look back over the centuries, this has been the conception, and it was also the dominant conception in the history of science. How we master nature was the way we looked at things. I think this is a very fundamental problem which we have. And this is a problem which does not lend itself to a solution simply through airing ideas. There needs to be a different appreciation. Some of this is found in some religions, but that is in itself is not good enough. What we really need is a better shared understanding of the very nature of science and what science is about, and of course the very nature of human society and what human progress is all about. Now, coming to the specific questions raised about what recovery might look like, I am still concerned, although many people have emphasized that this is the biggest budget we have. I'm still concerned that if we do not act strongly enough and well enough, we run the problems of allowing the COVID-19 recession to procrastinate and become a depression. This is a real problem. Have simple-minded solutions of blaming the other, of blaming foreign workers for many of our problems. And this, I think, is a huge problem, not only because it falls into the trap which people like Mr. Trump and so many others in Europe and elsewhere are promoting, of blaming the other for our problems. I think we really need to begin to understand that many of these problems are really, as the report notes, the problem is not in the stars, but really we have to look at humanity itself. So but humanity is changing. It's not unchanging, and the ideas of progress have to change over time, and these can still be changed. And I think this is where I think we need a more ethical view, and ethics which includes nature, as Tan Sri Zakri reminded us, in terms of how we make progress. So the three, I feel that we really need a stronger response to the COVID-19 recession. We also need greater discipline in terms of how we spend. there already are too many indications of the likelihood that money will be spent for many of the wrong things. The three areas which I would particularly want to encourage, I think what we have seen is that food supply chains have been disrupted, and I would suggest that they are going to be irreversibly disrupted. Many of you already know, for example, that in Vietnam, 8 or 9 provinces now have rising seawater levels increasing the salinity of the rice fields, which will certainly adversely affect production until such time that we develop saline resistant rice breeds. Now, this is a huge challenge. So we really need to think about food, but we have to go beyond the kind of colonial action. We're trying to reduce our food bill. We really need to think about food in terms of health, of nutrition, of safety. And in this regard, I think we really need to improve our food supply chains and improve and promote an integrated approach to school feeding, involving the Ministry of Health as well as Education, and also, of course, the Ministry of Agriculture in terms of getting much more food production. Vegetables and fruits will be very, very crucial. The last two areas,
Dr. Jomo, the clock is ticking very fast. Please wrap up in a couple more points, please. Apologies.
Okay, my last 2 points are, I think we really need to think about, we are already the single largest source of imports of photovoltaic solar panels into the US. This is an area where Malaysian companies should be involved in producing many of these panels. Most of these panels are currently produced by foreign companies which have chosen to locate here for all kinds of reasons. And the last point, of course, is that we have developed biodiesel, palm oil-based biodiesel way back in the 1980s, but we have not gone further in terms of ensuring its viability and trying to ensure that we go far more to the use of diesel rather than other sources. It is a shame that 30 years ago, when many of the contracts were given for independent power producers, they were supposed to produce with diesel. Now they are producing with coal. And that is a tremendous indictment of the failure of public policy to ensure that IPP, that the private sector actually does what is in the public interest, what is in the social interest, what is in the interest of sustainability. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Jomo. Ms. Gunn, you have the final word.
Oh, thank you. So, related back to the questions? Yeah. So, there's a question saying that whether, the budget 2021 is sufficient to address the issues. I think question is not sufficient, but rather than, whether these budget allocations are targeting the right beneficiaries. Are they effecting the right actions or any changes, in the society? I think that's more appropriate. Sometimes you may find, you don't need a lot of money in order to effect a positive change. So, which is why I think proper targeting is more important than just, getting a large sum of funds to do whatever you want. Green New Deal, what does it look like? I mean, taking inspiration from the report, I think the Green New Deal should be anchored on a nature-based human development, based on evolving institutional changes and society changes. And it's very, very important to have the behavioral change at the society level and individual level to brace, to enter into this new time. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Gunn. I think we've discussed at length the topic of Anthropocene and human development. I think just by way of conclusion, I think we have seen the HDR itself aimed to change the way we think about development. And I think when the issues of sustainability came up, there's even a newer dimension which we have to incorporate and balance human development with the need for environmental protection, natural resources, and so on. I think in this context, from our discussion, these ideas matter very much. These ideas of how we move forward in terms of planning our economy, how we move forward in terms of decision making and so on within the budget, etc. But the idea of sustainability has been there for a long time, actually. So here, this report is really looking into also the solutions and the mechanisms to change this rhetoric and these ideas into implementation. And that still, unfortunately, remains a challenge. But hopefully, reports such as the Human Development Report will help aid further the mainstreaming of ultimately, I think, sustainable development. With that, I thank you, my rockstar panelists, for joining us today. I thank you, UNDP, and thank you to all of you who've joined us online. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, bye.
Thank you, Mr. Alizan Mahadi and the panelists, Tan Sri Zaki, Dr. Jomo, and Ms. Gan Pek Chuan, for a very insightful and thought-provoking discussion. While preparing for the next panel discussion, we will have a 5-minute break for the Facebook viewers. Thank you again to everyone that participated in answering the questions. Welcome back again to the Facebook viewers. Without delaying any further, let us begin the second panel discussion for today, titled Catalyzing Action, with Ms. Manon Banier, Deputy Resident Representative, UNDP Malaysia, Singapore and Brunei Darussalam, as our moderator. Ms. Manon, please take the stage.
Thank you very much, and welcome everyone to this second panel on the launch of the 2020 Human Development Reports. First, I would like to thank all the very eminent panelists for the very interesting discussions in the first part of the panel, where I think we first I think learn about the Anthropocene era. No? I'm pretty sure a number of us did not really know or had not necessarily heard about the Anthropocene before, and how in this era planet does not shape the human, but human is actually shaping the planet. We also looked into its connection to human development. And I think we cannot anymore dissociate the concept of human development in isolation from the planet, and a number of examples, and even pushing the discussion and the boundaries in the first panel of how this can be done and where do we stand here in Malaysia. In the second panel, we will look into catalyzing action. If we look at the report actually states that almost 80% of the world's people believe that it's important to protect the planet. Having said so, only 50% are actually likely to take concrete actions. So why is this so? There seems to be a clear gap between people's values and people's behavior. So what is the cause of this disconnect between all the solutions? Many solutions have actually been put in place or designed, and they remain on small scales. It's extremely challenging to go at a larger scale. And this is what this panel will actually look into today, and how we can unlock some of the deeper, going one level down, an obstacle to advance human development that is kind and supportive of the planet and nature. So this panel will discuss why most of the discussed solutions are not being implemented fully, and in many cases are not yet at the scales to make a difference that is needed to bridge that gap. We have actually another very eminent panel today, 3 panelists that will bring a very complementary, I would say, perspective in our discussion today. Our first panelist is Professor Leong, who is a professor in Sunway University and the Deputy Director of the Jeffrey Sachs Center on Sustainable Development. His work at the center is largely on outreach, education, training in the areas of social inclusion and the Sustainable Development Goals. He has many years of experience and conducted several workshop training programs for governments, official, corporate manager, academic, student, leaders, and mostly related to sustainability solutions and strategies. So we really look forward to hear about some of those strategies and how we bridge that gap and are able to go at scale with some of those strategies. Our second panelist, on my right, Puan Nurliza, welcome. Very pleased to have you with us today. So Puan Nurliza is the Chief Executive of Urbanis Malaysia, a center of excellence for urban well-being and sustainability of Malaysia. She has many years of experience as well, and working at all levels of government, working with decision makers, stakeholder, national level, local level, towards localizing the agendas and the World Urban Forum agenda. No? She was actually the local secretariat for the World Urban Forum 9. She has been in her consultant firm for more than 27 years, where her experience covered a wide range of planning discipline, written several development plans and blueprints that have contributed towards nation building. No? So I think you will really bring, Nurliza, this ground level experience and how we can really, what are we learning from the experience of Urbania, and that can inform from going to small scale, what are the gaps, and going from small scales to larger scales. No? And last but not least, I would like to welcome Mr. Thiru, Thank you for being with us today. Mr. Thiro, he's an electrical engineer who has more than 20 years of experience in the field of climate change and energy. He has a very sound experience in developing climate change strategies and policies for large organizations as well as the Malaysian government. During his career, he led successful registrations of 12 carbon offset projects in Malaysia under the UNFCCC. And in the last 10 years, actually, he was just sharing with me, he was the first one to actually join Petronas with an expertise on climate change. So I think he has really seen how the company has evolved over the last 10 years. And he has been instrumental in development and implementation of climate change actions, such as Petronas' position and framework on climate change and Petronas' carbon commitment, which include the introduction of the internal carbon price and disclosure of GHG target. No? So I think, again, a very pragmatic, I would say, experience from the private sector. How do we drive change from within, and what are the bottlenecks that we can actually encounter to not only change the DNA, I would say, of the private sector, but really translate it into concrete action and impact at the end of the day. So welcome to our three panelists. If I looked at the pool and the questions that were asked to our followers and people following on the Zoom, the first question was, how well is Malaysia doing on planetary sustainability? And I think you can all see the results on your screen, no? So somehow it doesn't seem that Malaysia is doing as good, no? It seems like it goes a little bit, most probably, with the 80% of the world that is thinking a planet is important and we should probably do better, no? Somewhat poorly, 50%, neutral, 21st. No one is considering that we are doing very well. So surely scope and scope for more actions and more engagement from everyone. So if I start with the first question, and I would like to invite Professor Leon to kind of reflect a little bit. When we see that data, this awareness that we have to take actions, we're not doing well, there are solutions, but then there's a gap between the solutions and the values that more and more people actually embrace. There is more and more recognition on the importance to take actions, and somehow the scale that we have been able to reach so far. No? So over to you, Professor Leon. No?
Thank you, Manon Bernia, and so nice to meet my fellow panelists. Thanks for the question. Basically, if my reading of the UNDP embargo report is correct, it's shown that the dangers are out there, but the solutions are also out there. So what's the problem? Like what Manon said, is a disconnect or is that a gap? And page 2 of the UNDP Human Development Report asks for mechanisms of change to catalyze action. I think that's where the effort lies. You need to catalyze action. 2030 is only 10 years from now. 2050 is not too long away. We are running out of time, we're losing time. So how do we catalyze action? There's a gap. If you look at the great transformation, there's another word, I think, besides Anthropocene, there's another word that appears in UNDP report. The great transformations that really changes society, systems, economic systems, social systems, have two important factors supporting it. One is technology. That means we have the technology. Like what Manon said, the solutions are out there. There's sustainable transport, sustainable urban design, sustainable fisheries, sustainable livestock rearing, sustainable lifestyle, sustainable waste management, sustainable banking, sustainable finance, sustainable investment, sustainable health, sustainable tourism, sustainable energy systems, sustainable mining, sustainable investments, you name it. I think every important economic activity already has developed sustainability solutions. I think the missing component is markets. Markets. Somehow the demand is not there or not yet perceived to be there. Hence, businesses are not responding soon enough. Businesses are not responding fast enough, even though we are running out of time. The first session is very important. The Anthropocene, the dangers before us is very important. We got to tell people. A lot of people know. 80% of the population, like what Manon says, kind of know. So we all know. We got to keep telling them we are in a crisis situation. But crisis situation produces good behavior. People volunteer during crisis. So I'm going to talk a little bit, maybe later, but not now, that maybe we need to energize, we need to stimulate more volunteerism. But first, the issue is, where should the solution lies? The two poll questions, question 2 and 3, provided multiple choice answers. But that's not the answer I'd like to share with you. It never provides an answer whereby it is the market that will solve the problem. If private sector is going to be afraid of anything, private sector will be worried about regulators coming in, central bank telling the banks that you're going to green your portfolio. Petronas responded, Shell, even Hibiscus are looking at their portfolio. But I think another thing the businesses will respond very fast, and something they will be worried about, and they already sense it, is demand for their products and services. Buyers' decision making. And what their competitors are doing, if they don't respond and their competitors are responding faster than them, they will be worried. So I think the key is catalyzing this consumer, urban consumers, to respond and to buy every day. Choose sustainability when we buy. And actually that effort doesn't require much, because you have a lot of labels out there, you have a lot of certification out there, you go to the supermarket there. I think that's what we need to do now. I look at the trends, even one of the largest market research organization in the world, Nielsen, already has stated very clearly, sustainability is the buying decision. And that's a trend. The millennials are choosing more and more sustainability criteria. The ones younger than the Generation Z are favoring more sustainability. So there's a gap, I think. Is there any way we can... The agents of change are the businesses. I had governments and politics have sided with the wrong businesses. I don't know what else they're going to do if they've been siding the wrong and businesses that are not doing well, the ones that have a lot of power and interest and a lot of money to spend on lobbies. But consumers make daily decisions. I think we look at movements like Friday for Future, which Manon and Bernier yesterday shared with me. I forgot that there's Greta Thunberg's movement. But those movements has catalyzed billions of young people, influenced them. Her thinking, her action resonate with the young. But that's just Friday. We got to do more. Monday, Tuesday until Sunday. So I asked myself, what do we do every day? We buy things every day. That's the thing that we can do easily. We have to choose sustainability when we buy. How do we influence more people to choose sustainability? We don't need 100% consumers. My own estimate, if you look at marginal theories of economics, is if you do take 10% who start to choose sustainability, look at the shelf, that product, that company has failed on sustainability criteria. Next on the shelf is that brand, that company that I will buy. And again, research has shown that consumers, especially Asian consumers, surprisingly, are willing to pay more, a bit more, even 10-20% more for sustainability. Imagine if a lot more people do it, and these are the kinds of things we do every day. You can keep influencing people, the influencers, the rock stars in this mission, got to go out there. So that is my take now, with the question posed to me, can we do something to catalyze this? I think we can do. It's just about volunteering. It's not even requiring much. I go to say, I make a volunteer that I will choose sustainability, and I'll get 3 more persons for me, keep reminding ourselves. There's another question about where lies the power of collective behavior. The collective behavior is well known that small groups are stronger than large groups. Strong groups have a lot of power. They influence each other, they strengthen each other, and they are all very directed. So if we can have lots of small groups, creating small groups of 4 or 5 people, reminding each other every day we buy sustainability. We buy sustainability. I think businesses will respond much faster because the solutions are out there. And if consumers are willing to pay a bit more, and with mass economy of scale, the price will drop. We already see this in energy happening, small scale energy. I think in every sector, it's a chance. We do have a chance to ignite a movement and to reverse the trend by 2050. But if we move fast enough, I think we can do it by 2030. So that's my comment so far. Perhaps with some questions later, I can add more to that.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Leong, for bringing some very important element and bring the perspective that the issue might not be that much on the solution. We need more solution, most probably, but really looking on the market side. And I think this will probably resonate with Thibaut from Petronas now, and how they have changed their business model to actually look at it from a customer side. You also highlighted clearly a generation gap, no? Like, I think the new generation being a little bit more, and I would like in the second round of question maybe to reflect a little bit more on that, because the generation that is not in power yet, but is moving up. How do we in that time break that generation gap and change behavior of consumer?
Department of Statistics Malaysia shows that there are 7.5 million persons out of 32 million in Malaysia who are aged 0 to 14. They are born today. In 10 years' time, they are the consumers. In 20 years' time, there's a lot out there. I think we just need to keep telling businesses that's the direction. And these new people, this young generation, they will choose sustainability. The market research generation theory. Sorry for the interruption, but I just want to tell you how many of these people are out there.
Yeah, no, I think you're bringing a very, very relevant point, and they're very often excluded from those discussions. But I will bring that point back, because it's also very close to me, how we engage, how we listen more to young people in this whole conversation. No? But now I would like to ask to move to Puno Lisa and look from a very pragmatic and ground level experience on all the years you've been implementing and promoting those solutions. What is your learning in terms of the gap and how we can bridge that gap? No?
Oh, thank you, Manan, and thank you for having me here today. Congratulations on the HDR 2020 report. I just had a speed read through it, not as extensive as the first panelist maybe. But I think taking off from what the first panelist has said, also from Professor Leong, I totally agree that there's a lot of solutions out there. And yet, we are still talking about the same issues over and over again. I conduct a lot of focus group discussion in the work that I do, and I find that sometimes, you can speak to the same community, and after 10 years going back to them, the same issues come back again, and you seem to realize and wonder why the same complaints, the same issues are raising from time to time. So I think that, there are so many things that are creating all these kind of gaps. Prof. Leong talked about markets, and he talked about the younger generation being a big opportunity and agent of change if we could harness that potential early. But we also must remember that these are the young generations which are more accessible to information because they are more tech savvy in that sense. They are more informed because they have access to data and so forth. They're listening on a daily basis. But a lot of issues that we hear in cities or urban areas, where for Malaysia, that's almost like 78% of where people are living. And we are talking about people of middle income and lower income, which mainly are living in these areas. And whether or not they have the same level of access as compared to people who are more fortunate, or the younger generations which actually understand where to obtain this information. So yeah, going back to that, that means to say that information is a gap also in terms of policies, for example. I think we have more than 30 over acts and laws and regulations in Malaysia that touch on environmental matters. But whether or not they are being localized, whether or not that's being related to on the ground, I think that's something that I'm not sure whether we've done it well enough. Of course, we have all kinds of programs at the local government. We have Local Agenda 21. We have community programs that are being run by NGOs and community groups. But I think most of the time when we're doing it, we always concentrate on the social dimension of those programs. The meet and greet, the social integration part. But how do we bring that kind of events or situation where we could also inform them about policies, in the most layman manner that they can understand. I was involved in a small session a few weeks ago on the diabetes group, and it was very interesting to see that a lot of our diabetes patients in Malaysia are actually from the low-income community, and malnutrition is one of the issues that's being raised. So if we talk about access to food, quality food, it's expensive, So yeah, we talk about food security in the first session just now, but how do we make all that kind of well-being, quality of life, just not only accessible, but affordable? And I think that is where our community finds that this agenda on sustainability is not for them, which is, talking about that base of population, the lower income people, the middle income people. It's not a priority for them as yet, It's maybe a discussion that's to be discussed at a high-level table, or discussion of boardrooms, or politicians, or policymakers, So I think we expect them to be agents of change. We expect them to be responsible consumers. But at the same time, we also are not making it very easy for them in terms of accessibility, affordability, and so that they become more responsible. Because we talk about that, we have a choice. People have the choice. We are always saying that it's us that have to make that change. But I think we look at all the indices, people who are poor generally are most difficult to create and absorb those changes fast enough, because it's not a priority for them. So I think these are issues which, if we talk about gaps, we have, how do we integrate our policies better? How do we localize our policies in a manner that is not only words, but also in a form that is more actionable at the local level, so that people at the ground, at the community level, understand what they are doing. We ask them to walk, we ask them to cycle, because we said that, reduce carbon emission, they really don't care about the carbon emission because they want accessibility. They just want to get from point A to point B. So it's up to us to ensure that that accessibility is easier, faster, I think that's the, at the end of the day, it's all about those simple way of measuring well-being for communities. That is probably why you get that kind of responses just now in terms of the survey, almost 70% of people are not saying we're doing enough. And we've been doing this since 70s, 80s, before that even, and 30 over X, I would say. But the surveys are not showing. And that's the perception of communities and people, which is, I would be scared actually to look at that kind of perception numbers to think, because that would mean a lot more work for a lot of us on the ground to change that perception level. Probably that's for now, yeah.
Thank you very much. Puan Nurliza, I think you brought as well some very important aspect, the importance of localizing all those frameworks that are developed at national levels, very good intention, but how do they resonate in the local context, and how we make them. You talked a lot about the accessibility, especially when there's a price tag associated to it. Everyone is, and I think Professor Leon, you did mention the other way that people are ready to pay more. And I think what you're bringing is a part of the population is probably ready to pay more, but part of it is still excluded. And there's a price tag to sustainability and to choosing and one product versus another. And when I guess your basic needs are not fulfilled, then how can we, what kind of incentive, and maybe I will go to...
Can I provide an answer to that?
Huh?
Can I try to provide an answer to that?
Yes,
because it's basically that initial market entry. You provide a slight premium for producers, manufacturers of goods and services, products, that allow them to adopt solutions which are sustainable, including wages and salaries of their staff. That will help the lower income, the wages rise. But if that, as they move the production method, businesses look for economy of scale. The methods achieve economy of scale. The price of products and services will drop.
Yeah.
And they will drop to the level where they'll be affordable by the lower income community. So you got to ignite that process by getting those people choosing sustainability. Then the production process will be more sustainable, and eventually even mass production is sustainable or adopt more sustainable processes and technology. Then the product price drops and become affordable to the lower income community. That means they will benefit, but at a later stage. To ask people to change their lifestyle and to choose sustainability when they're really dealing with basic needs is asking too much. But I think there is enough segment of the population. That's why I'm looking for positive sign. I think they're reaching 10 to 20 million. If businesses know about it, they will start changing their processes. They want food sustainability label on their cans and all the packaging, so that when people buy, they say, okay, I'll buy that one. The price will drop. Just the nature of production, the price will drop. Even electric cars will drop. The price will drop. And then the price for fossil fuel engines will rise because there's no market for it. So we're going to ignite the process of businesses moving towards that, adopting that direction, then it will benefit the lower income community. That's mine.
Yeah, it's the ripple effect. Now, if we are able to go to go at scale, then it will reach out part of it.
I hope it's true.
Yeah. Now I would like to invite Mr. Tibuno to really bring us the perspective from Petronas. We were talking a lot about market, and of course at the core of private sector engagement. We know the Sustainable Development Goals, and the report as well highlight the very important role that the private sector has in really connecting the dots between human development and the impact on the planet. So I think you have a little presentation that you would like to show. So if we could put the PowerPoint on, please. If we could show. Yeah, thank you very much. Over to you.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so let me just give you a brief snapshot. Sustainability is not new in Petronas. For your information, Petronas' first sustainability report was produced in 2007. That's almost 13 years back. We have been producing sustainability reports. And I do join Petronas in 2011, where we started to look into climate change and other elements of human rights and biodiversity. We have a sustainable development department in Petronas, right? Over 10 years now. So over the years, if you see, Petronas is known as an oil and gas company. From the PDA 1974, Dr. Jomo has mentioned it. We existed to develop this natural resource that the country has, which is oil and gas. So over the years, we have been contributing very well to the sustainable development by giving a lot of returns in terms of economic benefits to the country by selling the oil and gas resource and building roads and for the economic development, right? So it has been a catalyst. Petronas has been a catalyst from 1974 to the Malaysian government. So while we are moving ahead into the game of supplying energy for the world's growing demand, we have to embrace the challenge of also limiting the amount of growing greenhouse gas emissions which is causing global warming and limiting to 1.5 degrees, right? So we have a challenge to supply energy, at the same time limit the global warming, right? So this is a very tough challenge. So we have been thinking about it seriously. The energy industry globally has been thinking about it, and we thought that we can be a solution, right? We can be a solution by providing a low carbon energy in the beginning, right? Which is, if you compare to coal, oil and gas, gas is the cleanest of the fossil fuels. So maybe you should catalyze on using that first. That's a catalyst to it. Then as well, while we are doing that, you generate revenue from there, and then you started to use it to invest into renewables. Because you know that that is going to be part of the solution for the climate change issues, along with natural gas. So that's a perfect combination. So we thought of changing the mission statement for Petronas back 1-2 years back. So we are no more known as oil and gas company. So the new statement of purpose you can see there on the screen, a progressive energy is no more oil and gas, right? Energy and solution partner, enriching lives for sustainable future. So the word sustainable future, enriching lives, well-being, it resonates in the purpose of existence of the company itself, right? That is the core fundamental change that has happened over the last few years, right? Thanks to the leadership of Petronas, thanks to the board members, and thanks to everybody who has been trying to shift in the way that we do things as a responsible company. And in order to achieve this, we have the 3 strategies. First is we have to maximize the cash generator. We have to continue to generate revenue and then give back into the countries, host countries' development and so on. So we have to continue to make money, right? That's sustainability means you need to have a financially sustainable company to deliver sustainability, right? Otherwise, you can't be an NGO, right? And just do without generating money. Second is we have to expand the core business. Otherwise, there's no growth. That's why it's called sustainable development. Development is growth. You need to have growth. In order to have growth, you need to expand the business. As I said, we have almost 70 to 80% of the reserves that we have in Petronas are gas. So that's perfect because natural gas is the fuel that is needed during this energy transition. And then we couple with the renewable energy. So we have a new renewable energy unit in Petronas, looking into renewable energy business. We acquired a company in India, and we almost have 1 gigawatt of capacity today, right? Over the last 2 years is a huge expansion. If you look into how much gigawatt we had 4 or 5 years back, it was just 10 megawatt solar power plant in Gebeng. And today we have 10 megawatt to 1,000 megawatt. That's a huge change in the past 2-3 years, right? It's a huge leap. And that's where this last strategy about stepping out is all about. Like stepping out into renewables, stepping out into bio-based products, petrochemical products, looking into carbon neutral products. So this is all stepping out into delivering what the customer wants. This is where Professor Leong has mentioned. Look into the demand, look into the customer focus, what they want, we deliver that. So next slide, please. So if you look into this, the whole thing is driven by the sustainability agenda. If you look into the 17 SDGs, we have picked out 7 SDGs which we can positively contribute directly, right? Of course, we have the spillover effects to the next 10, but if you focus on the 10, on the 7 that you can see on the slide here, on health and well-being, health at HSE is part of oil and gas companies or DNE. Education, interestingly, number 4, because we have been providing scholarships almost now almost 24,000 beneficiaries, right? Number of beneficiaries. And then affordable and clean energy, natural gas as well as renewable energy can play on the SDG 7. Number 8, for economic growth and jobs, how we are contributing back to the economic development of the host country. And you're looking into responsible consumption, on innovation, you're looking into circular economies on number 12, and the last one, climate action. So we are seeing this in 4 lenses. Number 1 is economic lens, continued value creation, safeguarding environment, the environmental lens, the social lens, providing social impact, and then the governance is super important for any organization, especially private sector. So you take these 4 lenses and then you see your business moving forward, which is the next slide, is saying that the climate actions that we have are guided by the position and framework, where we say that we recognize our responsibility as a player in the energy sector to balance the issue of climate change, the 1.5 degrees and so on. At the same time, we need to make sure that access for energy, as Dr. Jomo has mentioned, and reliable energy. It's not when the energy is only delivered when the sun shines and wind blows. Now, you need to have a security of supply. So that's where the balance of gas and renewables coming into the picture with the battery technologies and so on to provide reliable energy. And in climate change, we are looking into the complete cycle of it's measuring how much of footprint you have as organization and product, looking into mitigations, which I'll come in the next slide, but adaptation is also important because this is where it will impact the Human Development Index because the cost of adaptation is huge. And hurricanes and floods, sea level rise is going to impact the communities and the economy. It is the externalities of the climate change, right? Externalities of cost of, which is not factored in today, which will become a huge cost in the future, right? Next slide, please. If you look briefly into the 10 climate actions that we are promoting, we use the natural gas as a capital that we have, continue to promote natural gas as a low carbon fuel against coal and against more other higher emitting fossil fuels, and reduce methane emissions, which is 25 times more harmful, right? Then looking into flaring and venting, this is very interesting to note, flaring and venting, right? If you see in 1980s, Malaysia has built a pipeline, and that's where the first combined cycle gas turbines came into the picture, right? And where the gas came from was those designs of old designs of platforms where the gas was not a good commodity in 1970s and 1980s, right? We used to flare the gas, and we only sell the oil. But there started the golden age of gas, where the Malaysian government thought that it would be a brilliant idea to use the gas and generate power. And that's how the gas come into the picture. So we are still continuing that journey of gathering the gas and sending back and making it a beneficial use. The gas is coming for 200 kilometers offshore in the middle of South China Sea. You have to put the pipelines across and to reach to the country. And energy efficiency, we are talking about delivering fuel efficiency, like when you sell the petrol, and diesel, make sure that the customers can drive a longer kilometer for the same liter that you pour in. We add in additives. That's why the Formula One and all those things Petronas involved are doing R&D to make sure that the product that we give to the customer are more efficient, right? And then considering carbon prices, decision making, there's something new we have introduced. We know that a lot of jurisdictions in the country that we operate, like in South Africa, like in Australia, there was a carbon tax and now they repealed, and Canada, they have this carbon tax, and we anticipate that there could be a carbon tax which may impact your business portfolio. So we consider this internally, and then we have renewable energy solution I've explained. We also have been looking into conserving forest. We have spent around 83 million, it's in the report, ringgit, to the conservation of Imbak Canyon Forest in Sabah over the past few years. And we continue to do work with the Malaysian government and the Department of Forestry to look into potential conservation, right, which can absorb more CO2 into the forest. And we are looking into low carbon solutions like carbon capture storage. We have patented many technologies on capturing on CO2. We are going to develop some high CO2 fields which are going to use the carbon capture and storage technologies in South China Sea. That could be one of the largest carbon capture storage offshore project in the world, maybe coming soon. And the last portion is understanding how we can adapt to the climate change. So next slide, please. I'm going very fast. Please go and refer to the sustainability reports. All the details are there. There's many things that we have been doing. I just need to summarize in a very short time. The 3 things that we announced last year is we put a short-term target, 2024. We want to manage our greenhouse gas emissions. We want to step up our ambition on clean energy. And then we want to look into the society bit by nurturing future leaders. So we have put a short-term target of capping our GHG emissions to 49.5 million. I think we are one of the first company who has actually declared this kind of ambition in the short term. And then 3,000 megawatt of installed renewable energy. That's also another target that we have put publicly. Another thing is we want to increase the number of beneficiaries to 24,000 cumulative beneficiaries through our education programs, right? Like STEM, even we are helping for scholarships and so on. So these are short-term targets, but you think that we have been doing good? I think not yet. That's why the company took a quantum leap and announcing another long-term aspiration. I think we are one of the few, you can go to the next slide, which we have announced a net zero carbon emission target in Asia. We are almost like being on the front line of looking into a sustainability aspiration, we call it. Because it's not just about emissions, it is also about the life cycle thinking, it's also about the just transition. That means you look into the well-being of people. So the narrative there is net zero carbon emissions by 2050 with positive social impacts, adherence to business ethics, right, and corporate governance. So the social element is always tied back to the environmental element, right, when we look into net zero. So I'll stop here for further discussion and deliberation. Otherwise, I'll be talking a day long about Petronas.
Yeah, extremely interesting. No, and I think you've mentioned in your presentation one, I think, key challenge, which is how you ensure. You said we need to continue on a growth trajectory.
Yes.
That is core to business and really continue, and you have a financial growth, but integrating a sustainable business model that actually ensure, a longer term in the planet.
Yep.
So I'm very curious to see from your presentation. I see you're basically transforming the DNA of the company. No, it's not a CSR program anymore, no. where a lot of companies are still looking at environment, social issues from a CSR perspective. To really a complete shift within how the company is actually operating, defining itself, its vision, its contribution to society. So what, from your 10 years of experience, what were the main drivers of this change in the company? How were you able to do that? A new company wants to start and is still with the CSR and trying to transit into a more comprehensive and holistic approach. What are the drivers?
Right. I think you can simply put it as external and internal drivers. There's always two elements of it. The external drivers are perfectly explained by Professor Leong and also Dr. Jomo in the morning, right? So if you see those elements like the market, that people want certain type of products and demands from the customers. I think back in 2011 and 12, we sell lubricants, right, to global market. We have requests from Fiat, right, asking for a carbon footprint reports of Petronas. So the customers are asking. So we realized that even back a decade back, right? And then we started to put things internally and so on. And education that it goes on internally is also important. Awareness that you need to build is also important. When we have 48,000 employees, right? Imagine that's like a train. You want to move the train, right? It's not enough that you have a powerful engine, which is the top leadership saying that, yes, we want to go. But you need to bring that entire inertia moving. You need to get every single coach to move and release their brakes. If none of these coaches release their brakes, the train will not move, right? So this is most important thing, that we need to educate the internal force, saying that this is why we need to do, what is the purpose of this company and what we can deliver, what is the mission, and if we don't do that, what will be the repercussions? The entire organization and employees need to understand. That's internally. The change in terms of mindset for not only the leadership, but also into the last worker, boilerman or the non-executives, even a cleaner in the company, need to understand their responsibility, their purpose, right? Why I'm saying cleaner is sometimes we think cleaner is not important, but cleaner is also important for health and safety, because non-clean places will cause a lot of issues, health and safety issues, right? I'm coming from HSC department as well. Yeah. So those kind of responsibility need to be understood. External forces is also important for the companies to understand the risk of the market, right? Like electric vehicles coming in Europe, and what will happen to the demand. Gone are the days we are talking about peak oil and so on. Now we are talking about peak demand. Demand itself will be peaking. So what will be the share of your supply of energy into that capped demand? So that raises a lot of interesting questions. What should we supply to our customers? So understanding the external and internal changing landscapes and changing the way we do business is very, very important.
Very good, thank you. Yeah, I think focusing on both drivers, no, external and external, and you were talking about mindset that needs to change everywhere, and this brings me back to you, Professor Leon, and you know, we often hear that many people we see more and more, I think, in young people, you've stated, no, taking action and wanting new product, but we also hear often that people sometimes feel my contribution is not going to make a big difference, no, in the scale of things. Like the problem seems so big for a number of us, and how can we, and will my action really make a difference on the long hand? So it's really, how can we, it's usually our own personal perception of our personal agency, no? How can we enhance personal agency, Professor Leon, no? So that everyone really, the contributions of everyone can actually, we can see that everyone's contribution can contribute to larger scale impact, no? Over to you. Oh, we cannot hear you, Professor Leon.
Sorry. Yes, this is a very important question. This is one of the other major challenges. How do you catalyze a movement so that it has an impact large enough on businesses? We often ask ourselves, even myself, this is too small to have any impact. But thanks to that, I'm so grateful to listen to Petronas. A sector is actually one of the hardest to transition to sustainability. Is also doing it. So if Petronas and these oil and gas companies can reposition themselves, it's not only regulators and their investors and the fund managers telling them that you got to do something. because of this challenge. I think for me, if I go into to pump petrol or diesel into my car, it's just not Petronas out there. Next to Petronas is Shell. And Shell has already positioned itself as an energy company moving green. And if people like me are more aware of it, and there are a lot more people are aware of it, I think Petronas have no choice. It's not that difficult for me to drive past Petronas and go to Shell. It doesn't take any effort and the price is the same. If I embed sustainability criteria. So there lies the issue. Can we get 2 million Malaysians who earn income or have retirement savings that each time we buy petrol and diesel and all this, we choose companies which are a lot more sustainable than the other brands that are more. I think if we can get 2 million consumers, it will effect a lot of change, not only in Petronas, oil and gas, but a lot of even appliances manufacturers. So that's where, if we can get that, you will get that impact. In fact, if I have a chance, I'd love to work with UNDP. How do we catalyze that? I did a calculation, 50 influencers, that's all we need. Influencers are amazingly impactful. If influencers can just tell people their age group, their cohort, their friends, just like Greta Thunberg could do. Because making those choices does not require much effort and require much more money. In fact, I can even delay buying if I don't like that product and company because I know it's not sustainable or produced in a sustainable, not sustainable, or that company refuse to change. At least some companies are making amends to their historical problems that they created and making amends. Then I feel comfortable buying those things. Actually, those choices that we make daily when we go to the supermarket and stores does not require much effort. It's just how do we tell people and get that 2 million consumers out there in Malaysia, out of 32 million people, to make that choice. And I think a lot of resources will respond. However difficult, even down to changing the mindset of the sweepers from the board level all the way. That's what Petronas is doing, and there's a lot of organizations are doing. I've been meeting companies that says, don't say you will meet up with companies that says, I don't do and I won't do, I will never do because I don't believe in all this. You don't hear that anymore. You will hear that, yes, I want to do something, but I can't do now. Is there any way I can do? And now we know the solutions are out there. And now we ask the consumers to buy their products and services. If they transition to sustainability, then they will have a chance to transition. Existing businesses can transition. And that's where we can actually reach the Paris Climate Agreement target and reach the sustainability goals a lot faster. So I'm actually want to play a role in this, influencing people. Maybe Jomo can be an influencer too. Influencing consumer change because it can work. So that's where the impact lies. I calculated that we need 50 influencers to make 2 million people, consumers in Malaysia. Make that change, I think companies will respond immediately.
Very, very pragmatic, I would say, a solution that I really like, actually. I'm like, okay, how do we make this moving, no? How we influence social norms and how influencers are have such a big power, no, in terms of influencing the social norms and how we can leverage that in a positive way, no? Very,
I hate to say this,
yes,
Nolisa, but you know, even the lower income people in their motorbike can have an impact.
Yeah.
They can buy from Petronas because of what is Petronas doing to the environment and the society, or they can buy from Shell. Even the small motorbike can make a difference because there are a lot of motorbikers out there.
Yeah.
Right.
If we gang them together and act collectively. Sorry to say this.
I have something to add on. Something I'm seeing, maybe Dr. Leong cannot see. We can see a TV in front here. And in front of the TV, I don't know, the camera can focus on the label, the Energy Star label there on the TV on the right-hand side. You can see there's an Energy Star that's from Energy Commission. I was involved in that, doing that label 2005, right? And that's an energy efficient label, which gives a 5-star rating for any TV that produces, including fan and aircon. So talking about consumer choice, right? What will make somebody to buy a 5-star? For example, for this conference, right? I'm coming back to the question of supply chain, right? How a company can influence that. For example, you have UNDP organizing this session, right? UNDP should put a demand. Any company who's providing services to me need to prove that you are buying a 5-star rated TV. You should provide to me sustainable sources of services. If you wanted to rent a space, you wanted to be maybe a green building, which is a LEED green building, the Malaysian one, GBI certified, or so on. Buy equipments which are 5-star rating, energy efficient rating. So if you put such requirements, you will create a demand. Yeah. The organization creates a demand for such products. That's how it changed the behaviors of the supply chain. Because consumer is one thing, right? Those who are buying petrol, diesel, those things from the shelves of the shops. But it's also the private sector's role to influence the SMEs, small, medium industries, to change their supply chain. It's not important that Petronas changed our net zero emission is just our role. No, we can't just do it by ourselves. We have to, because this mindset will trickle into the value chain. And eventually we'll say that, okay, all our suppliers need to adhere to human rights. That's already there in our contracts, right? You need to adhere to human rights. Otherwise you cannot be in our approved vendor list. We do human rights due diligence on people, saying that how you are doing. And maybe in future we'll do a net zero due diligence. So how are you going to help us to achieve net zero? If you're not, then you're not in that pool of potential vendors. So we have to put these requirements from the corporate, then the supply chain will eventually will change and shift.
Yeah, you pointed the idea of institutional buying, corporate purchasing, besides individual consumer buying.
Yes.
I think you're right. But the two will go together, hand in hand.
Right.
Because corporate purchasing are also decided by people working there. And increasingly it will be by the younger generation. Yeah. Well-trained, well-educated, sitting in purchasing departments. They will influence their bosses.
Right.
They will influence their bosses. And what really motivates everybody, if you ask me, is session 1 of this whole forum. The danger before us, the existential crisis that we are facing, and the growing inequality. I think nobody who's a human being can tolerate that. I think that will be very convincing. After that, I don't really require much incentive or a stick or a carrot or a market system to change the pricing for me to make those choices. Mm. In certain small ways, we will volunteer to do that. If I have a chance, I want to work with people to create this, people who willingly volunteer to pay a bit more to influence the market. I think it will work, because if you see what is happening in the Anthropocene, you will be scared. You will know, and people will be influenced by the children. The young will influence their grandparents, their aunts and uncles, and then everybody will chip in. It's just chipping in, actually. It's not really trying to squeeze your whole budget. It's just chipping in. That 20% chipping in will change the whole market, will change Petronas' entire portfolio or asset portfolio of Petronas. That's my belief.
Yeah, I think you both really illustrate the two different sides, from the individual consumer impact to, really impacting the whole supply chain, that you are a multinational or you are a small SMEs. Everyone has a role to play, and it's each actor's responsibility to not only change its own behavior, but to request it from others as well in the whole supply chain. No? I think, Nolisa, you wanted to add as well on this point, no? Yeah.
I just wanted to add that, it's very clear that what we are talking about is we are asking for, in a way, societal change, and behavior change, society making different choice. And then you also were touching a little bit that you wanted to also explore on whether or not we need incentives. Do people need to be incentivized in order to make that societal change? But I mean, definitely, incentives are good, but we all know that incentives normally come from policies itself. And this is where when we outline any form of incentives, I think people also need to understand what is the motive behind those incentives, because most of the time we create incentives to motivate, create awareness to people, but whether or not the outcome is achievable is something that I'm not sure whether we really measure those outcomes well enough. So we find that incentives are given, and most of the time, many incentives are given to even corporate, like the green tax incentives are given. A lot of introduction of those tax incentives, and that's why I think, like what Professor Leong is saying and Iru was saying, is that I think for corporate and businesses, they should be doing it. It's no longer about whether or not we are afraid of what the change in the climate scene, how the human age is taking over the world. It is actually already happening for decades. That's why I think it is definitely a responsibility of businesses, corporations to make that change. But most importantly is there enough incentives for common people, for communities to actually also make those changes. I mean, we don't see a lot of that, but I live in PJ, and PJ is I think one of the first city that actually have introduced such kind of community-based tax for initiatives done to reduce our carbon emission. So if we do composting, if we own EV, if we have LED features like the green rating systems in our house, all that could lead up to even up to 100% of our total taxes that we pay in PJ. So that's really wonderful. But again, the narrative of that, because the take-up rate is also not a lot, and just like making that choice whether or not we pump Petronas or Shell, how do we know that? So again, the communication plays a big role here. We're not communicating enough. Also, why are we giving those incentives? Why people are making choice as a consumer to save the world? To make that choice, contributing towards the impact of climate change, reducing those impacts. So I think we definitely have some incentives here and there, but I also see some incentives sometimes conflicting one another. And this is probably also because of where they come from, because most incentives come from policies, and the disintegration of policies itself might lead to incentives which could conflict one another. Like, I mean, on one hand, you want why we introduce transit-oriented development, for example. I'm being a planner. It's especially for areas around transits, because we want people to actually walk to train stations. But you don't see that in Malaysia. You'll be very surprised that we still have the most cars around transit stations. And this is because we have conflicting policies. On one hand, we give them a bonus in terms of densities to build this development around transits, but we are not reducing car parks. We are not increasing parking rates, for example. So this, on one hand, we are giving incentives, but on the other hand, we have other regulation and policies which are not really supporting those incentives. So I think, like just as many solutions are out there, like Professor Leong mentioned, there are also many policies, incentives that has been played. But what is most needed is actually we need to communicate more among ourselves. We need to come to a point where we should avoid any kind of conflicts amongst ourselves, so that consumers are not confused to that point, and they understand fully if they were to make a choice, what would be that choice and why. And if they want to take up that incentives, why are they doing that? It's not just for the monetary return, but also for the well-being of not only human beings, but the environment per se. So I find that, there need to be a lot more work in terms of integrating horizontal, vertical policies as well as incentives, to say, So on one hand, it's not just about the numbers, and rolling them out, but it's actually more on really looking at the outcome of what we are giving.
Yeah, very, very interesting. And I think it connects to what Niloy was mentioning in the introduction remark and also in the first panel, that we need to take a much more systemic approach, and look at issues not from a linear perspective. And connecting back to your first point when you talked about how do we bring those frameworks to the local level, do you feel that working at the local level could help actually strengthening the work at the local level, and how can we do that to work, to bring this system more thinking approach? Sometimes maybe at national level it's still hard to, to tackle. Do you see that there are opportunities to strengthen this interaction at the local level, and how can we do that?
I think there is a big opportunity to actually harness the energy at the local level, and if we do that well enough, we can create a lot of change there. In some of the work we do with communities, we are asking community to make those calls, not us. We are just giving them the narrative as to why, and it's actually up to them on their choice on what they want to do. Even when we were building community hubs, physical community hubs for some of the communities in the low-cost housing areas, we actually just allow them to use it for whatever they want to use it. And I feel that when we give it to them, there is more sense of responsibility as to not only to take care of the facility, but to use it well for, for the benefit of their own local people. And I think if we continue to do this and have a bottom-up kind of a feedback communication system, probably we are able to reduce those gaps better. Even if we are now trying to localize the SDGs at the federal level, we can never do that without the local inputs. Because at the end of the day, the partnership that happens at the ground, be it between business to communities or to the government, it needs that collaboration effort. So yes, I really think that awareness is very important. Working with the local is very important, but making them understand why they're doing it is even more important. So like we have this app now, Active Life, where we just want people to change their mode of travel by walking and taking the bicycle or other form of public transport. And at the same time, we tell them how much calories they burn as well as how much carbon they save. So it's a fun way of doing it, and we get them to do it by communities, and then they can challenge between communities. I guess what we're trying to do is also trying to encourage them in a more in an indirect manner, and hopefully we will be able to see some positive change from that.
Thank you, Nazila. I think already the hour went so quickly. I think we could go on and continue. It's such an interesting discussion. There are a few questions. The first one is, I think, for you. How is Petronas linking climate change to human rights? And is this reflected in the company's business strategy in an integrated manner, particularly in achieving your net zero commitment? Very good question.
Yep. I think it's a very good question. Let me give a a brief understanding of human rights, right? So when you're talking about human rights, what is that? I think it came during the ages of war. People were having, and so on. So it evolved. But today, listening to morning's discussion, that only 10% of the students having access to mobile and 90% don't have access to mobile, right? Not about access to energy, access to mobile devices and Wi-Fi, that they are unable to participate in the school sessions, including some children, that they miss the education if everybody go into mobile, right? So now the question is, having a Wi-Fi, is it a human rights today? Maybe not, but eventually we may think yes, it is, right? So this is an evolving question, right? So fundamentally, human rights is also about access to energy, right? Everybody should have access to energy that will help us for human development, right? Access to energy is important catalyst. We're not talking about catalyst. It's a catalyst for human development. Of course, we have a direct and indirect impact on human rights in every single actions that Petronas do. As I said, the rate of electrification in Malaysia was low 30 years back, and it's like almost 90% today, right? Why? Because we have access to electricity, and partly contributed by also Petronas by supplying the right fuel, right, for power generation electricity. Yes, that's part of human rights, is always there, integrated as part of it. But on top of it, there's also human rights angle coming from the employees. 48,000 employees that we are looking into. Yes, they need to be upskilled, they need to be protected in terms of wages, and we have to also make sure human rights is not there protected in the value chain, so that no child labor is employed in our value chain, right? All those things are adhered. That's why I mentioned that we are doing human right due diligence. But when you're talking about net zero, I talked about past just now, right? So, and the present I covered. So if you talk about future, this is about the energy transition. So when the energy transition is happening, there will be a change. Like once you have people who do the typewriting, when the computers came, all those people disappeared. When the IoTs came, a lot of the low-level jobs disappearing, right? So what happened to these people, right? That's a human rights question. So you need to either upskill or reskill them so that those who are doing typewriters can use Microsoft Word and Microsoft Excel. You have upskilled them, right? This has happened in the past. So similarly, when we are transiting from a high carbon society to a low carbon society or low carbon economy, we need to ensure that the manpower and skills that we have should be uplifted, right? This is called the term just transition. If you go on Google, you find this word just transition, because it's energy transition. Then that energy transition need to happen in a just or fair, in a justice way, right? So that the employees are protected, the biodiversity is protected, and it's a range of big concepts. So those things are seen from the four lenses that I've shown you, the framework of Petronas, looking into the four lenses of economic, social, environment, and governance, ensure that the life cycle thinking in every single product that we produce is not closing the problem of climate change, but opening up another problem of water or any other contaminants or human rights issues. So it has to be life cycle thinking, wholesome, looking into the four lenses. So yes, it has been integrated, and we are looking into the challenges of looking into the energy transition. And what do we do with our existing skill force and manpower? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Second question, I think it will be for you, Professor Leong, but how can individuals be encouraged, empowered, and or incentivized to change their attitudes and action to lead to more responsible and sustainable lifestyles and practices? No?
My answer to that is, we got to go out and tell more. Tell the population about all the things that are covered in session 1 today. It's a real threat. In crisis moment, people do volunteer. They don't look at incentives, or they don't have to be forced. They do volunteer. And they will respond. They will volunteer to choose good, to choose to buy from companies that do good, do more good. We got to tell more of what's happening to the world today. That that we are really in a crisis. Prof. Zakri says, yes, It's getting the scientists to work with the algors. In Malaysia, we need to get the scientists who really understand the natural scientists, the climate scientists, and the social scientists who understand all the breakdown in our social fabric, to work with the influencers, the people whom others would like to listen to, and convey the message. And I do believe that people will volunteer. I'm not talking about quitting your job and do voluntary work.
Yeah.
We're talking about when you go to a supermarket shelf and you go to a petrol station, or you go into a electrical shop or electronics, you volunteer to choose sustainability. Because you have the money, you decide. Even social issues, human rights, labor, how companies treat their workers, is so fully exposed today in the COVID. Our top exporters are all being exposed. They should know this long before, that you cannot hide these things. And people will respond, people will get angry. The companies that threw all the garbage into our water system, who want to buy anything from them? Nobody will buy anything from them because they're a threat. So we need to tell more of what the session 1 content, and get the scientists, like what Prof. Zakri said, and work with the people who can really influence the algors. And I feel people will volunteer. I will volunteer if I keep being reminded, choose sustainability, choose sustainability, not only environment friendly companies, but also socially responsible companies. We will get there.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Leong, and really focusing the role of awareness, influencer, education. I had a whole question as well on the role of education, but we didn't have time to go through. But I think this is very encouraging and empowering words, no, to hear that there is actually a positive future for going at scale if we use those strategies. No? The last question, and I will ask the panelists to be brief in the response because I think we will soon run out, and I would like to have one quick question at the end before the closing. How do we ensure that market demand mechanisms deliver actual sustainability and not just the appearance of sustainability? I don't know, Thibaut, if you would like to take this one briefly. Yeah, very briefly.
Yeah. How do we ensure that market demand mechanisms deliver actual sustainability? It is actually a social engineering.
Yeah.
It is a social engineering question.
How do you measure? Yeah.
Yeah, you're asking to an engineer, so so I'll try to answer in more. The answer lies in the economic sense, right? So what creates the demand? It is if you think that certain product is good, then you will buy, right? So that awareness actually creates the demand. So where the awareness starts, it should start from home, right? Then because every single home, people in the home, they are the corporate leaders, they are the consumers, they are the people who are in every levels of society, until from the government officials and so on, the decision makers. I think the awareness need to be building in. And what's happening is, it's naturally happening with the younger generation. When they are coming into the workforce, they are also demanding the companies to change. Otherwise, they will not join that particular company, right? We had the conversation earlier. So some people won't join certain companies because they feel that they are not a responsible company, right? Similarly, that's creating a demand for the corporates and private sectors to change the strategies because they need the workforce who can work for them for the next few years. So it is not just a greenwashing that's required. I think fundamental change in the mindset is very, very important. And as the younger generation coming in, and they will be the voters, they will be the consumer power, purchasing power, they will be holding it. I think things will shift. But the question is, do we have the time to wait for that generation to come and create the tipping point? What do we do with the older one like us?
Yes.
Can I just say one thing on this?
Yes.
I'm just going to say that, we always talk about market demand, but, I think if we talk about market needs, maybe that's could change some of the narrative, and understanding what that market segment is all about. And again, it's people, consumers, businesses. So I think if we change it in that perspective, and look at sustainability needs and change the whole market dimensions and demand dimensions altogether. I mean, like how to build sustainable homes, for example. Can we have a mixed income home, which is another thing which, I wish it happens in Malaysia. So there are a lot of things, but because how we are driving market demand in a certain direction, the narrative of sustainability get lost in that translation, where it's always talking about that three equation. And this is where I think probably the whole narrative needs to be relooked at.
Not only from a demand perspective, but of how we define our own needs. No?
Yes.
And it's linked when we were talking about reduce, reuse, recycle. It's not only about continuing to expand your needs, but how your needs can actually be different. No?
Yeah.
And I just want to stress, because we didn't have time to talk about it more, but the role of young people. No? I think it came out in all of your presentation that young people are the one driving as well the movement. So, and that there is still a generation gap. So before closing, I would like us to, if we can show the response to the third question. I think we didn't have time to do the second one, but the third question, because it's all about action. And we've asked the audience, the pool response. And I would like our panelists to think 1 minute, because we talk about action, we talk about generation gap. I think we're all from the older generation than the younger. So I would like to close within 3 or 5 words. What's your next action? Okay. Building on the discussion today, I think, Professor Leon, you push a lot for empowerment and taking action and agency. So I'd like to hear in 3 words, and let's hear what the people attending the session have been saying. No, very strong. What can they do to contribute? Like just what I was mentioning: reduce, reuse, recycle, redefining how we consume. No. The second one, energy efficiency, lifestyle, and consumption. Again, very strong. Resonate with what we have discussed in the panel today. The volunteerism, no, as an avenue for taking action and changing the way development is done. Switch to sustainable sources of energy as well, something we can do from our home to big corporation taking action directly. And urban green spaces, no, greening urban spaces, I think will resonate with Urbanica work. So before closing, I would like, in 3-5 words, what's your next action? Okay, who should we start with? Professor Leon?
Can I say something?
Yes, what's your next action?
I want to assure people that choosing sustainability, you will not be fooled, because greenwashing is not that easy anymore.
Yeah.
You cannot greenwash anymore, so let's choose sustainability and not be afraid. Their companies may greenwash, their 1 star they actually put 5 stars, but they actually 1 star. I don't think they will dare to do this anymore. There's just too much people watching. So let's continue to choose sustainability in all things we buy.
Very good. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, I think very simple. Practice 3R, right?
3R. Okay.
Practice 3R.
Okay.
At home. And then use more renewable energy, solar panels on your rooftop. Number 3, please go and plant a tree. If possible, every month. Okay. And water that and take care of the tree. Please. You need to experience the environment. Don't talk about it. Yeah. Thank you.
Very good.
Yeah.
Last word over to you.
Yeah,
yes.
I guess from me and the work that we do, I guess the next section will be looking at the polls, and the discussion is more collaboration, more actions and more collaboration. I think that would be, we have to work on that, we have to run on that and see how we can move faster to get more results on the ground, and how we can collaborate also vertically and send this message up fast enough, whether there are channels that could open up easier to listen to the ground as well. So I think, that would be an action that is, that we would need to take almost immediately, I guess, Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much to our three panelists. This was a very interesting, thought-provoking, and I think empowering conversation. No, I heard a lot of hope in terms of what can we do together as a citizen, as a community, as an organization, as a big corporate, to actually accelerate progress, and really going back to the whole topic of human development, no? Expanding our choices, which is all about the concept of human development, but with really a sense and considering the impact that all our action has on the planet. No? So I hope that this was a very fruitful conversation for everyone, and I look forward to the next time where we can sit and discuss together. No? Thank you very much for your time.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Manon, and the panelists, Prof. Leong, TPR Nurliza, and Mr. Tirupati, for a very interesting and informative discourse. Before we end our event for today, I would like to invite Ms. Manon again to give her closing remarks.
Thank you very much. I will be very brief because I think you've heard me for some time already, for the last hour and a half. But I would really like to take this opportunity to first thank all the panelists that we had today for accepting our invitation and bring a very broad range of perspective and experience to help us understand and demystify the new Anthropocene epoch and how it connects to human development. The panelists also help us to look at our actions and how to overcome the deeper obstacle to a human development that is kind and supportive of nature. The vulnerability of global system has been exposed by COVID-19 pandemic, vulnerabilities which will only be exacerbated if little is done to address the damage caused by climate change. Yet, the pandemic has also given national and international authorities the opportunity to build back in a way which works towards planetary sustainability with policies that promote a green recovery aligned with the Paris Agreement and the Sustainable Development Goals. In the 30th anniversary edition of the Human Development Report, a new index is introduced to nudge our debate and attention to the environment. To better reflect the development of a planetary pressures adjusted human development index to better reflect development during the Anthropocene age, bringing climate and nature resources measures into the way we calculate development. As the report shows, no country in the world has yet achieved high human development without putting immense pressure on the planet. We spoke today, and most of the panelists have spoken today about the importance of awareness raising and education in introducing values which appreciate planetary sustainability, and to turn these values into self-reinforcing social norms, and to shape social and economic structures to foster these actions, and to empower people to act as agents of change. I hope that through this forum, each and every one of us got inspired to take action, no matter where we are, in our university, in our big company, in the government, in our community. What are you going to do differently as a result of this session? We talked about incentives as well, being essential tools to bridge the gap between behavior and values. The right policies and regulation have a role to play and can pay dividends with lasting impact. Individual, community, and the private sector must be encouraged to recognize the local nature-based solutions have the potential to contribute to global transformational change. UNDP in Malaysia, UNDP is supporting Malaysia in many fronts. Together with the people, with the Malaysian government, we hope to shift financial resources towards planetary sustainability, to nurture investment in people, infrastructure, and technology to transform society towards sustainability in the Anthropocene era. So thank you very much, everyone, for joining us today, and I look forward to hear about what action you have taken as a result of this session. Thank you.